Victor Langley didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed open the door of the Blackthorn Valley Bank on a Tuesday morning, dropped a leather folder onto Clarence Webb's desk, and said, loud enough for every clerk in the room to hear, "I want the Hawthorne note called in by Friday. All of it. Every cent." Clarence looked up slowly. "Victor, the man has until spring." He had until spring. Victor straightened his jacket. "Now he has until Friday. Unless you'd like to explain to the board why you keep extending credit to a ranch that's already dead." He smiled at the two customers near the window who had gone very still. "Besides, I hear he's got a fat woman running his kitchen now. You really think that's going to save him?" The laughter that followed was quiet and ugly, and it traveled the way ugly things always do in small towns. If this kind of story moves something in you, the kind where ordinary people refuse to stay beaten, then you're in the right place. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss what comes next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us the city or country where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. Evelyn Carter had spent the better part of her 38 years learning to walk into rooms where she wasn't wanted. She had learned it young in a farmhouse outside of Columbus, Ohio, where her mother used to say, "You've got to work twice as hard and take up half the space, Evelyn, or this world will eat you alive." It wasn't gentle advice. It wasn't meant to be. Her mother had been a practical woman who understood that the world did not reward women who waited for it to become fair. Evelyn carried that knowledge the way she carried everything, quietly, steadily, without complaint. She was not a small woman. She had never been small. At nearly 120 kilograms, she moved through the world in a body that attracted opinions from people who hadn't earned the right to give them. Strangers on market days. Employers who took one look and decided she wouldn't do. Men who assumed she ought to be grateful for any attention at all. She had learned to keep her face still when those opinions came. She had learned to let them pass over her the way a wind passes over stone. Loud for a moment, then gone. What she had not learned was how to stop wanting something more. The advertisement had been folded into thirds inside a letter her cousin Marta sent from Cheyenne. Marta had written, "I know this isn't what you pictured, but read it anyway." The advertisement was short, precise. It said that a cattle rancher in Blackthorn Valley, Wyoming, was seeking a wife with practical skills in food preservation, particularly salted beef production, and that he valued capability over appearance. He offered a private room, fair wages during a trial period, and the possibility of a permanent arrangement for the right woman. Evelyn had read it twice standing at her kitchen table in Columbus, where she had been making ends meet as a cook for a boarding house whose owner had recently informed her she was too heavy to be seen at the front counter. She wrote back the same evening. She listed her qualifications without apology. She described her 8 years of experience with large-scale meat preservation, her knowledge of salt ratios and barrel curing, her ability to manage food inventories and household accounts, and her experience working cattle farms during harvest. She did not describe her appearance. She did not mention her weight. Caleb Hawthorne's reply came 3 weeks later. It was businesslike and brief. He said her qualifications were exactly what he needed. He asked when she could arrive. She was on a train within the month. She arrived at Blackthorn Valley on a Wednesday afternoon in late September of 1884, when the light was coming sideways across the hills and the air smelled like dust and dry grass. She stepped off the platform with a trunk, a leather satchel, and the quiet determination of a woman who had already survived every version of the look she was about to receive. She received it immediately. The station master glanced up, took her in from boots to collar, and said nothing. A woman hanging laundry across the street stopped mid-motion and stared. Two men leaning against the feed store wall nudged each other. Evelyn set her trunk down, straightened her coat, and looked for the man who was supposed to meet her. Caleb Hawthorne was standing near a wagon at the edge of the platform, and she recognized him from the careful stillness of a man who was trying not to react to something unexpected. Howe was lean, weathered, somewhere in his mid-40s, with the kind of face that had spent too many years squinting into wind. He was wearing a good hat and a coat that had been mended at the elbow. When he saw her walking toward him, he straightened up, and his expression went through several things in quick succession: surprise, calculation, and then something that resolved itself into a careful blankness. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said. "Miss Carter." He removed his hat. He had manners, at least. "I wasn't expecting—" He stopped. "I know," she said. "Where would you like this trunk?" He blinked. Then he moved to the back of the wagon and lifted the trunk himself, which she had not expected. She noted it. A man who carried his own freight, who didn't wait for someone else to handle the inconvenient thing. That told her something. They drove out of town in silence. The road was rough and the wagon seat was hard, and the silence was the kind that had too many things moving underneath it. After about 10 minutes, Caleb said, "You listed experience with barrel curing." "Yes." "How many seasons?" 8. "Started on my uncle's farm in Indiana. He ran about 200 head and put up enough salted beef every fall to carry us through winter and sell the remainder in spring." Caleb nodded slowly, watching the road. "We run about 300 right now, down from 600 4 years ago." He said it like a man confessing something. "The drought hit us hard, lost a lot of the herd. Then the water rights dispute with Langley to the north tied up the creek access for almost a full season, and we lost more." "What's your current storage capacity?" He looked at her. She met the look steadily. "2 main buildings," he said. "About 40 barrels in rotation, but the north building's got a problem with the floor." "What kind of problem?" "Soft spot near the east wall. Think the drainage is off." Evelyn filed that away. "I'd like to look at the storage buildings first thing tomorrow morning." Another silence. Caleb seemed to be recalibrating something. Most women who come out to ranches don't usually ask to inspect the storage buildings first thing. "I'm not most women," she said. "Not with heat, just as a fact." He was quiet for another mile. Then, "No, I don't suppose you are." The ranch came into view around a long curve in the road, a main house, 2 large outbuildings, a bunkhouse, and a series of cattle pens stretching out into the distance. The land was wide and spare and had the particular beauty of a place that didn't try to prettify itself. Evelyn looked at it for a long time. "It's good land," she said. "Yes," Caleb said, "it is." That was the first thing they genuinely agreed on. The main house was clean but spare. There was a housekeeper, a weathered woman named Bess, who was about 60 and had the look of someone who had made peace with hard circumstances a long time ago. Bess showed Evelyn to her room, small, simply furnished, with a window that faced east, and asked if she needed anything. "I'll need a look at the kitchen inventory tomorrow, after the storage buildings," Evelyn said. Bess stared at her, then she said, "I'll have it ready." Evelyn slept that night with the sound of cattle somewhere in the distance and the particular quiet of a place that was genuinely far from anything else. She didn't sleep well. She rarely slept well in a new place. Instead, she lay in the dark and thought about the numbers Caleb had given her. 300 head down from 600, 2 storage buildings, a floor with a drainage problem. She thought about those things the way she thought about most problems, turning them over slowly, looking at each side. By morning, she had already started forming a picture. The north storage building was worse than Caleb had described. The soft spot near the east wall had spread, and when Evelyn pushed at the floorboards with the heel of her boot, 2 of them gave way slightly. The drainage channel running behind the building was partially blocked by 3 years of accumulated debris. Water had been seeping under the foundation every time it rained. "When's the last time someone cleared that channel?" she asked. The ranch hand standing with her, a young man named Pete who had drawn the short straw for accompaniment duty, shifted uncomfortably. "Can't rightly say, ma'am." She looked at the barrels along the north wall. They were sitting directly on the compromised boards. "How much product did you lose last season to spoilage?" Pete looked more uncomfortable. "Caleb would know the numbers better than me. I'll ask him," she said. She walked the length of the building, examining the barrel seals, checking the salt crusting on the lids, noting the temperature variation between the north and south walls. She crouched, not easily, but steadily, because she had learned that her body did everything she asked of it if she asked firmly enough, and looked under the lowest barrels. She found what she was looking for: moisture marks, old ones and recent ones. She stood up, dusted off her skirts, and made a note in the small ledger she had brought with her. Caleb was waiting outside the main house when she returned. I had a cup of coffee and the expression of a man who had spent the morning trying to decide how to feel about a situation that had not gone according to any plan he'd had. "The north building floor needs to be pulled up and the drainage cleared before we put anything else in there," she said without preamble. "The moisture's been working on those boards for at least 2 seasons. You've probably been losing product every time it rains without knowing exactly why." Caleb stared at her for a moment. "I had Pete look at it last fall. He said it was manageable." "Pete's not wrong that it's manageable. He's wrong about the timeline. If you put another season's worth of barrels in there without fixing the floor first, you'll lose more than product." She paused. "You'll lose the building." Silence. "That's a significant repair," he said. "It's a significant problem," she agreed. "How significant depends on how much you lost to spoilage last season." The number he gave her, after a long pause, made her close her eyes briefly. Not dramatically, just for a moment, The way you close your eyes when something confirms what you already suspected. That's roughly 30% of potential revenue, she said. Maybe more. I know, he said. I couldn't figure out why, because it wasn't the obvious things. It wasn't the salt ratios or the preparation. It was the storage conditions undermining the preservation after the work was already done. She met his eyes. The work wasn't the problem, Mr. Hawthorne. The system was. He was quiet for a long time. The coffee in his hand had gone cold. What do you suggest? I suggest we fix the floor in the north building before we do anything else. And I want to look at your inventory records for the last 3 seasons. Why 3 seasons? Because I want to see the pattern, not just last year. He brought her the records that evening. They sat at the kitchen table after supper. Bess had made a potato stew that was better than it looked, and spread the ledger books between them. Evelyn worked through the numbers steadily, while Caleb watched her in a way he probably didn't realize was obvious. She could feel the questions he wasn't asking. She had felt that kind of observation before, the particular attention of a person trying to figure out what exactly they were looking at. She let him look. After an hour, she set down her pencil and said, "You've got 3 problems layered on top of each other, and they've been feeding each other for the better part of 4 years. Go ahead." The storage loss is the first one. We've established that. The second is the cattle weight. You're bringing animals to processing lighter than you should be. What grazing land are you using on the east side? The east quarter has been resting. It's been overgrazed. Since when? 3 seasons back. Evelyn looked at him. It's been resting for 3 full seasons? We haven't had the manpower to manage it properly, so I left it. She picked up her pencil again and made another note. Land doesn't recover from overgrazing by being left alone. It needs management. It needs rotation. She tapped the pencil against the table once. The east quarter is probably ready to support a rotation herd right now, but the grasses have gone to the wrong species without management, so it looks worse than it is. That's your second problem. Caleb was leaning forward slightly. She noticed. The third, he said. The third is your creditor situation, she said. You've got a balloon note coming due in the spring. The amount is manageable if you've got a strong production season, but you need a strong production season which requires fixing problem 1 and problem 2 first. She looked up at him. Did you know about the Langley offer on the north parcel? Something shifted in Caleb's face. How do you know about that? Bess told me this morning, Evelyn said, while she was showing me the kitchen. She seemed to think I should know what I was walking into. Caleb pushed back from the table slightly. Langley has been trying to buy pieces of this land for 4 years. He started with a reasonable offer on the north parcel when we were in the water rights dispute. I said no. He went back to the bank and extended his line of credit through them, which gave him influence over my notes. Evelyn went still. She hadn't known that part. How much influence? She asked carefully. Enough, Caleb said. Enough that if I miss the spring payment, he'll be the first to know, and he's already told Clarence at the bank that he'd consider taking the property off their hands at a reduced rate. His jaw tightened. It's legal. I've had 3 different men tell me it's completely legal. Legal isn't the same as right, Evelyn said. No. His voice was flat. It isn't. She closed the ledger. Outside, the wind had come up, moving through the cattle pens with a low sound. She thought about Victor Langley, who she hadn't met yet and already understood completely. She had known men like him, men who looked at another person's difficulty and saw opportunity, men who waited patiently for the thing they wanted to fall into their hands because they'd quietly arranged for it to fall. I need you to be honest with me about something, she said. All right. When you placed that advertisement, when you wrote that you valued capability over appearance, did you mean that? Or was it something you wrote because you thought it would bring in more responses? Caleb looked at her for a long moment. He had the good grace to take the question seriously before he answered it. Both, he said finally. I meant it, and I also knew that a woman who looked like... He stopped, started again. I knew that a woman who wasn't what most men were looking for might be more willing to come to a ranch like this. That's honest, and it's not flattering to me. Evelyn looked at him. It's more honest than most answers I've gotten. What would you have done if I'd said otherwise? I'd have known you were a man who lied about small things to avoid discomfort, she said, and then I'd have known you'd lie about larger things for the same reason. And then this conversation would be the last useful one we'd have. Caleb was quiet. Then he let out a slow breath. You're very direct. I find it saves time. Yes. Something moved through his expression that wasn't quite a smile, but was in that direction. I expect it does. She left him sitting at the table with the ledgers and went to her room. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and thought about the ranch and the debt and the man who wanted to take it. And she thought about the months ahead, which looked like they were going to be neither easy nor simple. She thought about her mother's advice, about working twice as hard. She thought about the East Quarter land sitting idle for 3 seasons. She thought about a floor with a drainage problem and 30% revenue loss that nobody had traced to its source. She picked up her ledger and wrote for another hour before the candle burned too low to see by. In the morning, she was up before Caleb and before Bess, and she was standing in the East Quarter when the sun came fully over the hills, looking at grasses that had gone thick and thatchy from neglect, but under which, when she crouched and pulled back the surface layer, there was new growth coming up green and dense. The land wasn't dead, it was waiting. She stood up and looked out across it. 300 acres of eastern pasture, rested and underestimated and waiting for someone to stop treating it like a lost cause. She was still standing there when Pete found her 20 minutes later, sent by Bess, who'd discovered the porridge had gone cold and no one was at the table. "Caleb said to tell you breakfast is ready," Pete said, looking at her with the particular expression of a young man trying to figure out what a large woman was doing alone in the East Quarter at dawn. "Tell Caleb I'll be in directly," she said, "and tell him to bring the pasture maps if he has them." Pete stared. "Yes, ma'am." She watched him go back toward the house at a trot, and then she turned back to look at the East Quarter one more time. The morning light was coming across it golden and flat, the way good light always looked on land that still had something left to give. She had 3 problems to solve in approximately 7 months. She had worked with less. She pulled her coat tighter against the morning chill and walked back toward the house, already thinking about salt ratios and drainage channels and the particular expression on Caleb Hawthorne's face when something he hadn't expected turned out to be useful. The town of Blackthorn Valley would be watching. She knew that already. They would be watching and waiting, the way small towns always watched and waited, for the woman they had already decided was wrong for the job to prove them right. She intended to prove them something else entirely. When she came through the kitchen door, Bess was at the stove and Caleb was at the table with a mug of coffee and a map already spread out. He had brought the pasture maps without being asked twice. She registered that. A man who followed through on instructions without needing to be coaxed was a man worth working with. She sat down, pulled the map toward her, and said, "Show me the water sources." He leaned forward and pointed. "Main Creek here, running from the northwest. The tributary that fed the East Quarter." He paused. "Langley's got a diversion dam on the upper section. The water rights dispute. We lost access to it 2 years ago." "Is the dispute resolved?" "No." His voice was careful. "It's an arbitration. Could go either way." Evelyn studied the map. "So you're running 300 head on reduced water access and reduced pasture with a compromised storage building and a balloon note coming due in spring." She looked up. "And you thought what you needed was someone to make salted beef." Caleb had the decency to look at least slightly chagrined. "The salted beef contract is real. There's a buyer in Cheyenne who wants a regular supply." "I know the contract is real. I'm saying the salted beef isn't the answer. It's part of the answer." She tapped the map at the tributary line. "What's the current status of the arbitration? Do you have legal representation?" "I've got a lawyer in Laramie, Gideon Marsh. He's been working on it for 2 years." "And in 2 years he hasn't resolved it?" "He says the case is solid, but Langley has better lawyers and deeper pockets," Evelyn said. Not unkindly. "Yes," Caleb said. "That would be the accurate summary." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the map. Then, "Do you know what Langley's dam actually does to your water flow in dry months? Not what the lawyers say it does, what the actual water level shows." Caleb looked at her. "I haven't measured it. We should measure it." She folded her hands on the table. "If you can document the actual reduction in water flow through your pasture over the dry season, with measurements recorded regularly, witnessed, that's different from a legal argument about water rights. That's evidence." Caleb sat back in his chair. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. It wasn't quite respect yet. It was something earlier than respect. The look of a person discovering that the thing they thought was one shape was actually a different shape entirely. "You know a fair amount about legal evidence for someone whose job is salted beef," he said. "I spent 4 years managing the accounts for a boarding house that had a running dispute with the city over drainage easements," she said. "You learn." Bess set a plate of eggs down in front of Evelyn without being asked, which Evelyn noted and appreciated. Bess was watching everything without appearing to watch anything, which was its own form of intelligence. There are 3 things that need to happen in the next 6 weeks, Evelyn said, picking up her fork. The north building floor, the east quarter rotation, and beginning a written record of the water flow at the tributary junction. She looked at Caleb. Can you manage all 3 with the manpower you have? Not easily. Can you manage them? He thought about it. Pete and 2 of the other men, and myself. Then yes, you can manage them. She began eating. The eggs were good. Bess had used something, she couldn't tell immediately what, that gave them a flavor that was better than plain eggs. She would find out later. It was the kind of detail she always eventually found out. Across the table, Caleb Hawthorne was studying his coffee cup with the focused attention of a man rearranging the furniture of his understanding. Outside, the wind came across the Wyoming plain and pushed at the kitchen windows, and somewhere in the distance, Victor Langley was drinking his own morning coffee without a thought for the woman who had arrived at Hawthorne Ranch the day before. Because why would he? She was nothing. She was barely worth the joke he'd made at the feed store. He would, in approximately 7 months, discover that he was wrong about that. But on this particular morning, with the eggs still warm on the plate and the pasture map spread across the kitchen table and a man sitting across from her slowly realizing what exactly had walked through his door. On this morning, Evelyn Carter was only just beginning. She reached for her ledger. She picked up her pencil. She had work to do. The north building floor came up on a Thursday. Pete and 2 ranch hands named Darnell and Coop had started at first light, pulling boards with a pry bar while Evelyn stood in the doorway with her ledger and watched them work. The smell that came up from underneath was exactly what she had expected. Damp earth, old rot, the particular sourness of wood that had been wet and dried and wet again over several seasons. Caleb came by mid-morning, looked at the exposed ground beneath the boards, and said nothing for a full 30 seconds. "It's worse than I thought," he said finally. "It's about what I expected," Evelyn said. He looked at her sideways. "That's supposed to make me feel better?" "It's supposed to tell you that fixing it now costs less than fixing it in another year." She pointed toward the east corner where the moisture staining on the foundation stones was darkest. "The drainage channel behind this building needs to be cleared and redirected slightly south. If you redirect it south, it runs away from the foundation instead of toward it. Pete can probably do it in 2 days." "Pete's pulling boards right now." "Pete can pull boards in the morning and redirect drainage in the afternoon. He's young. He can manage." From inside the building, Pete, who had clearly heard this, made a sound that was not quite a groan, but was in that direction. Caleb almost smiled. Evelyn noticed. It changed his face in a way that made him look younger and less battered by whatever the last 4 years had done to him. "What about the barrels currently in there?" he asked. "I moved the sound ones to the south building last night with Bess's help. The compromised ones I've set aside for inspection. Some of the product can be reprocessed. Some of it is a loss." She had done the math already. She gave him the number. He was quiet. "I know," she said, because she did know. That number represented work and money and the labor of men who had already been stretched thin. But the reprocessable product, if we work it this week, we can recover about 60% of what would otherwise be a total loss. How? Resalting and resealing the partially compromised barrels. The beef itself is sound in most cases. It's the external seal that failed because of the humidity fluctuations. If we resalt within the next 4 days, before the degradation goes deeper, we can bring back roughly 18 barrels worth of product." She paused. "I'd like to start this afternoon." Caleb studied her face. She had noticed he did that. Studied her face when she said something he hadn't anticipated, as if her expression would tell him whether she was certain or guessing. She was certain. She let her face show it. "All right," he said. "What do you need?" 200 pounds of coarse salt, best for the afternoon, and a clean work surface in the main barn. "I can get the salt from town." "And while you're in town," she said, "I'd like you to stop by the land office and ask for the survey records on the tributary boundary between your property and Langley's. Don't say why you want them. Just say you're reviewing your property records." Caleb had started to put his hat on. He stopped. "Why the survey records?" "Because I want to see where the original water easement boundary was drawn, and whether Langley's diversion dam sits inside or outside of it." She met his eyes. Water diversion dams have to be built within specific legal boundaries. If his is outside the original easement line, even by a few feet, that's not an arbitration issue anymore. That's a trespass issue. The hat stayed in his hands for a moment. "Gideon Marsh has been arguing water rights for 2 years, Caleb said slowly. Gideon Marsh has been arguing the right to use water that flows through your property, Evelyn said. That's different from arguing that a structure was built illegally on or beyond a property boundary. Those are two different legal questions. She kept her voice even. I may be completely wrong. The survey records may show the dam is exactly where it's supposed to be, but I'd like to see the records before I decide that. Caleb put his hat on. I'll get the records, he said. He rode into town that afternoon. Evelyn spent the afternoon in the main barn with Bess, reprocessing barrels. It was heavy, meticulous work, opening each compromised barrel, checking the beef, assessing the salt distribution, repacking, resealing. Bess worked with a focused efficiency that Evelyn respected. She didn't talk much, Bess, but she listened to instruction clearly and executed it precisely. About 2 hours into the work, Bess said, without looking up from the barrel she was packing, "People in town are already talking. About me? About you." Bess's hands kept moving. Margaret Tilson at the dress shop told Lila Pierce that Caleb had ordered himself a wife from back east who turned out to be... She stopped. "Heavy," Evelyn said. "She said substantial," Bess said, like she was being careful about it. "Margaret Tilson has never met me. Margaret Tilson has never needed to meet someone to have an opinion about them." Bess pressed the salt down firmly. She also said she didn't see how a woman like you could run a ranch. Evelyn worked the salt around the edges of the barrel with both hands. "What did you say when she said that?" Bess looked up then. Her eyes were sharp and dark and completely direct. "I said I didn't know yet either, that I'd been watching you for 4 days and I hadn't made up my mind." A pause. "I've made up my mind now. And I said exactly nothing to Margaret Tilson, because that woman has never done a useful thing in her life, and her opinion is worth exactly as much as the effort she puts into the world." Bess went back to her barrel. "But I thought you should know what's being said." "Thank you," Evelyn said. She meant it. They worked in comfortable silence for another hour. Outside, the wind had shifted and was coming from the north now, and the temperature in the barn had dropped enough that their breath showed. Evelyn's back ached from bending over the barrels. She didn't stop. She had learned a long time ago that pain was not a reason to stop. It was information about what needed to be managed. By the time Caleb returned from town, they had reprocessed 14 barrels and had another 4 to finish in the morning. He came into the barn and looked at the neatly stacked, resealed barrels with an expression that was difficult to read. Then he pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and held it out. "Survey records," he said. She took the paper. She unfolded it against the barn wall and studied it in the fading light. He held a lantern up without being asked, which she noted. She looked at the survey lines. She found the tributary. She traced the easement boundary with her finger, and then she found the notation that marked the location of what the survey record called a recently constructed diversion structure, added by hand in a different ink than the original survey, which meant it had been added after the fact. She looked at the line. She looked at the boundary. The dam was 12 feet beyond the easement line, 12 feet inside Hawthorne land. "Caleb," she said. Something in her voice made him step closer and look at the paper himself. She watched his face as he found what she had found. He was still for a long time. "Son of a..." He caught himself. His jaw tightened. "He built it on my land." 12 feet over the boundary, Evelyn said carefully. "According to this survey." This survey was done in 1879, before the dispute, which means it predates the dam. She refolded the paper, which means the dam doesn't appear in the original survey because it wasn't there yet, and when it was built 12 feet over the line. She looked at him. "Do you trust Gideon Marsh?" "He's been reasonably honest." "Send him this record and ask him specifically whether Langley's dam constitutes a trespass rather than a water rights violation. Don't tell him I suggested it. Just ask the question and see what he says." Caleb took the paper back. He held it carefully, the way a man holds something that might be significant. "If you're right about this..." "I may not be. I'm not a lawyer. The survey may be challenged or the notation may be interpreted differently." She held up a hand. "But if I'm right, the entire shape of the dispute changes. You're not arguing for access to water. You're arguing for the removal of an illegal structure from your land." She met his eyes. "Those are very different arguments, and the second one doesn't require proving Langley intended harm. It just requires proving his structure is in the wrong place." Caleb looked at the paper in his hand for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "I hired you to make salted beef," he said. I know. You've been here 5 days. I know that too. He was quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the cattle pens and something banged against the fence. A loose board or a gate latch that needed attention. The lantern swayed slightly. My wife, Caleb said slowly, the one I had before, she died 4 years ago. February. The same winter we first lost access to the creek. He said it the way people say things they have been carrying a long time. Not for sympathy, just because context matters and silence is sometimes its own kind of lie. After she was gone, I kept doing the same things, working the same way, trying to hold the same shape of the operation together. He shook his head. I couldn't see that the shape had already changed, that I needed to change with it. Evelyn gave him a moment. What was her name? Clara. A brief pause. She was good with the accounts. Then she would have caught the drainage problem eventually. Something in Caleb's expression shifted. Something that was grief and something that was something else, something lighter. Yes, he said. She probably would have. Good, Evelyn said simply. Then I am in good company. She went back to the barrel she'd been resealing. After a moment, she heard Caleb set the lantern down on a post and heard him move to the remaining barrels and pick up a salt scoop without being asked. They worked together for another hour in the lamplight, the two of them in the barrels and the smell of salt and cured beef, and Evelyn thought that there were worse ways to begin an arrangement and worse men to begin one with. The letter from Gideon Marsh arrived 8 days later. It was addressed to Caleb as expected, but Caleb brought it to the kitchen table and handed it to Evelyn without opening it. She looked at him. You found it, he said. You should read it first. She opened it. Marsh's letter was 3 pages long, dense with legal language, and it said, once she had worked through the formal phrasing, exactly what she had hoped it would say. The survey notation, Marsh wrote, represented strong grounds for a trespass claim rather than a water rights dispute. If the original survey could be authenticated and the dam's position verified by a current survey, the legal action would shift from arbitration to an injunctive claim. An injunction, he noted, could be filed within weeks rather than months, and an injunction would require Langley to cease using the dam's diversion immediately pending resolution. Evelyn set the letter down. He agrees, Caleb said. He had been watching her face. He agrees, she confirmed. He also says that it will cost money to commission a new survey and that Langley will fight it and that it could still go against us depending on the judge. She met his eyes. He's right about all of that. But right now, Langley has the upper hand in every room he walks into because everyone believes the legal situation is settled in his favor. If you file an injunction, that changes. Suddenly, he's on the defensive. Suddenly, there's a legal action he has to respond to instead of one he's orchestrating. She tapped the letter. A man like Langley plans everything. He does not like surprises. An injunction claim he wasn't expecting is a surprise. Caleb was quiet. Then, Marsh says we need a current survey to proceed. How much? $40. Evelyn nodded once. I can cover 20 from the reprocessed barrel sales. The remaining stock I'm projecting will bring in enough by end of month to cover the other 20 if we move quickly. You've been running numbers on this. I run numbers on everything. It's faster than worrying. She looked at him steadily. Do you want to proceed? He picked up the letter and read it again, more slowly. She watched him read. He moved his lips slightly on the technical passages, which was not a sign of limited intelligence. It was a sign of a man making sure he understood precisely what he was committing to. Yes, he said, we proceed. It was the right decision. She had already known it was the right decision, but she was glad he arrived at it himself and on his own timeline. The current survey was commissioned the following week. The surveyor, a methodical man named Eldon Fitch, who smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and said very little, spent 2 days at the tributary boundary with his instruments. He worked carefully. He did not rush. On the second afternoon, he came to the main house and asked to speak with Caleb. Evelyn was in the kitchen reviewing inventory. She stayed where she was. Through the wall, she heard the murmur of voices, Eldon Fitch's measured tones and Caleb's single, sharp response. How far over? She heard Fitch say something. Then Caleb said, 14 feet. He came into the kitchen 2 minutes later. He looked like a man who had received news that was good and was trying to be careful about it because good news had disappointed him before. 14 feet, he said, not 12. 14. He sat down at the table. Fitch says the original survey was slightly off at the boundary. The post had shifted. The actual line is 2 feet further north than the 1879 survey showed, which means Langley's dam is 14 feet over the line, not 12. Evelyn set down her pencil. That's better. Yes, he rubbed the back of his neck. Fitch also says the upper section of the dam, the diversion gate, is positioned so that removing it won't damage the dam's lower foundation. It can be removed without destroying the whole structure, which means Langley can't argue that the injunction would require him to tear down something of significant value. Right. Caleb looked at her. You thought about that. I think about how the other side argues. It's useful. He shook his head slowly. Where did you learn all of this? Evelyn thought about the boarding house in Columbus and the drainage easement dispute and the 4 years of watching a landlord fight a city over 6 inches of right-of-way. She thought about reading the legal documents when no one was watching because she wanted to understand the shape of the thing, because understanding the shape of things had always been what she did. I paid attention when it wasn't my business to, she said, which meant eventually it became my business. Caleb sent the new survey results to Marsh that same week. Marsh filed the injunction within 10 days. Victor Langley received the court notice on a Friday morning. Evelyn didn't know this directly. She heard about it from Pete, who had heard it from the blacksmith's apprentice, who had been in the general store when Langley's foreman came in to buy supplies and made a noise about it that everyone in the store heard. Pete relayed this information at supper with the focused detail of a young man who understood that what he was describing mattered. He used a lot of words I won't repeat, Pete said, looking at Bess, who ignored this courtesy entirely. Did his foreman say what Langley intended to do? Evelyn asked. Said he was going to have his lawyers in Cheyenne tear the filing apart. Pete scooped potatoes onto his plate. He glanced at Bess again. He said Caleb Hawthorne had been listening to bad advice from a woman who didn't know what she was looking at. The table was quiet. Caleb set his fork down. That's what he said. His exact words were a bit different, Pete said, uncomfortably aware of the temperature of the room. I imagine they were, Evelyn said. She went back to eating. Her voice was perfectly level. What else did he say? Pete blinked. He had probably expected a different reaction. He said he'd be at the bank before week's end to talk to Clarence Webb, and that Clarence would find it in his interest to call in Caleb's note on the grounds of... He said something about financial mismanagement. Caleb's jaw tightened. He can't call the note early without grounds. He's going to try to create grounds, Evelyn said. She looked at Caleb. How up-to-date is our documentation on the reprocessed barrel sales? Our documentation? She held his gaze. I have the receipts from the Cheyenne buyer and the 2 local buyers. Written contracts or handshake agreements? A pause. Handshake. We need written contracts before the end of the week. She set down her own fork. If Langley goes to Clarence Webb and argues that this ranch is mismanaged, Webb is going to look at the accounts. If the accounts show revenue from secured contracts, contracts with buyers' signatures on them, that's different from revenue from informal sales. She looked around the table. Pete, is the Dunmore Ranch buying any of our product this season? Old man Dunmore said last month he might want some for the winter. Set up a meeting. I want a signed contract for whatever Dunmore will commit to before Thursday. She looked at Caleb. Who else? Caleb thought. The hotel in Casper. The cook there has bought from me before. Write them today. Not a casual letter. A formal contract offer with pricing and delivery schedule. I'll draft the letter, she said. You sign it. He looked at her for a moment. Darnell and Coop, who had been eating with careful invisibility, both studied their plates with intense focus. All right, Caleb said. They drafted the letters that evening. Evelyn wrote the supply contracts in plain, specific language. Quantities, prices, delivery dates, signatures required. Caleb reviewed them and added his signature. She addressed them in her clearest hand. They went out the next morning with Pete, who drove them to town for posting. While they were doing all of this, the East Quarter rotation was beginning to take hold. Caleb had moved 40 head to the East Quarter 2 weeks earlier, following Evelyn's rotation plan. The grass there, which had looked dead and useless, had responded. Animals that had been underweight were already showing improvement in condition. Evelyn walked the East Quarter every other morning, looking at the grasses, looking at the cattle, writing down what she saw. The third morning she walked it, she found Caleb already there. He was standing at the fence line, watching the cattle graze. He had a coffee cup in his hand and hadn't heard her coming until she was fairly close. He turned and didn't seem startled, which meant he had been too deep in his own thoughts to react quickly. They look better, he said. Yes, the grass is coming in well under the thatch. In another 3 weeks, we can run the larger group through and really start recovering the weight before winter. He nodded. Howe was quiet for a moment. The cattle moved slowly through the long morning light, and the world was very large and very quiet around them. I owe you an apology, he said. Evelyn looked at him. For what? For the way I looked at you when you got off the train. He kept his eyes on the cattle. I tried not to, but I did it anyway, and I think you saw it. She had seen it. She said nothing. I was raised better than that, he said. My mother would be ashamed of me. People look, Evelyn said. It's what they do next that matters. He turned then and looked at her directly. What I did next was bring you the pasture maps without making you ask twice. Yes, she said. That's what I noticed. The wind moved through the east quarter grass and the cattle went on grazing, and somewhere behind them at the ranch, the sound of Pete clearing the drainage channel carried faintly across the morning air. The work of the place was always present. It was that kind of place. My mother also used to say, Caleb said, that a person shows you who they are inside of a week. Everything after that is just confirmation. He looked back at the cattle. I think she was right. Evelyn thought about what she had been shown in 5 weeks at Hawthorne Ranch. A compromised floor and a mismanaged pasture and a water dispute that had been argued from the wrong angle for 2 years. She thought about what she had learned about Caleb, that he carried his own freight, that he followed through, that he was honest about the things that were hard to be honest about. Your mother sounds like she knew a few things, she said. She knew most things, he said. Just took the rest of us a while to catch up. The sun had fully cleared the hills by then, and the east quarter was bright with it, the grass silvery and green at once, the cattle moving in their patient, unhurried way. Evelyn finished her notes in the ledger and turned back toward the ranch house, and after a moment she heard Caleb fall into step beside her. Not crowding her, not managing her, just walking beside her the way people walk when they are working toward the same destination. It was not a dramatic thing. It was barely a thing at all. But it was the first morning they walked back to the house together instead of separately, and small things Evelyn had learned were how large things always began. 3 days later, Clarence Webb summoned Caleb to the bank. Caleb came to find Evelyn before he went. She was in the kitchen reviewing the week's accounts, and she looked up when she heard his footsteps, because she had already learned that Caleb's footsteps when something was wrong moved differently than his ordinary footsteps. Webb wants to see me this afternoon, he said. Langley got to him. Probably. Take the signed contracts, she said immediately. Take the Dunmore contract, the Cheyenne buyer contract, and the hotel letter. And take the current accounts ledger. I've updated it through yesterday. She stood up and went to the shelf where she kept the ledgers and pulled the relevant one. Every entry is dated and sourced. Every sale is documented. She handed it to him. If Clarence Webb tries to argue financial mismanagement, you put these on his desk. Caleb took the ledger. He looked at it for a moment, then he looked at her. You prepared for this. I've been preparing for this since the morning of the second day, she said, when you told me about Langley's influence at the bank. Howe was quiet. He turned the ledger in his hands. What if he calls the note anyway? What if the contracts aren't enough? Evelyn had thought about this. She had thought about it carefully and honestly, and without the comfort of pretending the worst couldn't happen. If he calls the note, we have approximately 60 days under the terms before default. In 60 days, with the injunction filed and the East Quarter rotation running properly and the salted beef contract delivering, I believe we can demonstrate solvency sufficiently to refinance through a different institution. She paused. It's not the outcome we want, but it's survivable. You've mapped that out. Yes. When? 2 weeks ago, she said, when Langley's foreman made that noise at the general store. Caleb looked at her for a long, still moment. The kitchen was quiet except for the stove and the faint sound of Darnell's work somewhere outside. Evelyn, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She noted it. Yes, she said. I'm glad you answered that advertisement, he said, simply, without decoration. She held that for a moment. It was, she thought, the most honest thing anyone had said to her in a very long time. Go talk to Clarence Webb, she said, and don't let him rush you. Take your time with the contracts. Make him read every line. He put his hat on and went. She stood in the kitchen after he left and looked at the accounts ledger still open on the table. The one she'd handed him was the copy, and traced her pencil down the column of numbers that represented 5 weeks of work. Numbers that told a story if you knew how to read them. A story of a ranch that had been losing ground slowly and was now, just barely, beginning to hold. Outside, Pete was whistling something tuneless while he worked on the fence. Bess's footsteps moved above her on the second floor. The ranch breathed around her in its ordinary way, full of the sounds of labor and weather and the small, ongoing business of keeping things alive. Evelyn picked up her pencil and went back to work. She did not know yet what Clarence Webb would say to Caleb in that bank office. She did not know yet what Victor Langley was planning, though she was certain he was planning something, because men like Langley never had only one move. She did not know how the injunction would resolve, or whether the East Quarter would fully recover before winter, or whether the spring note could be met without the crisis she'd mapped a survival path through. What she knew was the same thing she had always known, the thing her mother had told her and life had confirmed in every hard season since. You work with what you have, you plan for what you can see and prepare for what you can't, and you do not stop moving forward just because someone has decided you shouldn't be able to. She turned the page in her ledger and started a new column. Caleb came back from the bank in the middle of the afternoon, and Evelyn knew before he said a word that it had not gone the way they'd hoped. It wasn't that his face showed despair. Caleb wasn't a man who wore despair on his face. What he wore was the careful stillness of a person who had received a blow and was still deciding how bad it was before he allowed himself to feel it. She had learned to read that particular stillness in the weeks since she'd arrived. The way you learn to read weather when you live somewhere the weather matters. He sat down at the kitchen table and set his hat on the chair beside him and said, "Webb's giving us 60 days. Evelyn set her pencil down. He called the note. Not formally, not yet. Caleb folded his hands on the table. He said the bank is conducting a routine review of all outstanding agricultural loans given the regional drought conditions. He said it was nothing personal. He said it with Langley's lawyer sitting in the corner of the room like he'd been there all morning. Langley's lawyer was at the bank meeting. Terrence Holt, from Cheyenne, expensive suit, said about 4 words the entire time, none of them directly to me. Caleb's jaw tightened. He didn't need to say anything. His being there said everything. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. What were the 4 words? Caleb looked at her. He looked at the contracts, your contracts, and he said, pending delivery, not secured. The kitchen was very still. He's arguing that a signed supply contract is not secured revenue until the product is delivered and payment received, Evelyn said. That's what he's arguing. She picked her pencil back up and tapped it once against the ledger. It was a fair legal point. She didn't like it, but it was fair. Holt knew what he was doing. Did you leave the contracts with Webb? Copies. You told me to make copies. Good. She thought. The Cheyenne buyer. When is the first scheduled delivery? 2 weeks. Move it up. Send Pete with the first shipment next week if we can have the product ready. Once the payment is received, that revenue is no longer pending. It's documented income. She looked at Caleb. Holt's argument disappears the moment the first payment clears. Can we have the product ready in a week? If we start tomorrow and work the full week, yes. She stood up and went to the shelf where she kept the production notes. We have enough processed inventory to meet the first contracted delivery. It's about 30 barrels. If we stage them correctly and confirm the delivery route, Pete can't drive 30 barrels to Cheyenne alone. I know. We need Darnell and one of the other men. She turned back to him. Can you spare 3 men for a 3-day drive? Caleb ran his hand through his hair. He had a habit of doing that when he was calculating. She had noticed it early. Coop's supposed to be rotating the west fence line this week. The west fence can wait a week. The delivery can't. She met his eyes. I know you know that. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he let out a breath that was neither agreement nor argument, but something in between. The sound of a man choosing between 2 difficulties and picking the one he can live with. All right, he said. 3 men to Cheyenne, and I want a receipt from the buyer, signed and dated on delivery, not an informal acknowledgement, a receipt. Holt will just find another objection. Probably, Evelyn said, but we take away every objection he has, one at a time, until he runs out of them. She paused, and while the men are in Cheyenne, I want them to stop at Marsh's office with a copy of the new survey. Marsh needs to know about the 60-day pressure so he can accelerate the injunction timeline. Caleb nodded slowly. He was tired. She could see it. The particular tiredness of a man who had been fighting the same war from the wrong position for years. His eyes had a quality she recognized from her own mirror on certain evenings. Not defeat, just the weight of duration. When did you last sleep properly? She asked. He blinked. What? Sleep. More than a few hours. He seemed genuinely uncertain about the answer, which told her what she needed to know. I sleep fine, he said, in the way people say things they know aren't true but aren't ready to examine. You've been up before me every morning this week, she said, and I'm up before 5. The ranch doesn't run itself. The ranch will run better if the man running it isn't making decisions on 4 hours of sleep. She didn't say it with sharpness, just matter-of-factly, the way her mother used to deliver hard observations, not unkindly, but without the softening that made people think they could ignore them. The next 6 weeks are going to be the hardest ones. You need to be thinking clearly. He stared at her. Then, unexpectedly, something loosened in his expression. You sound like Clara. Is that good or bad? He stopped. A brief thing moved across his face. It's good, he said. Clara was usually right. Then go to bed at a reasonable hour, Evelyn said, and went back to her production notes. She heard him make a sound that might have been a laugh, quiet, almost reluctant, the kind that catches a person off guard. Then he picked up his hat and left the kitchen, and after a moment she heard his boots on the porch steps going toward the barn to find Pete. The next morning, Evelyn was up at 4:30. She lit the kitchen lamp and spread the production schedule across the table and began calculating what 30 barrels in 7 days would actually require. It was more than they had done in any single week since her arrival, but it was not more than the equipment and the available salt supply could handle. The constraints were time and labor, and time she could only manage. Labor she could arrange. She made a list of what she needed. She was still making it when Bess came down at 5 and stopped in the doorway, looked at the lamp and the spread papers and said, "How long have you been up?" "Not long," Evelyn said. Bess made a sound that indicated she believed none of this. She went to the stove and started the fire without further comment. After a few minutes, she said, from behind Evelyn, "Caleb told me last night about the bank meeting." "Yes. He also told me what you said about Holt's argument." Bess set the kettle on. He seemed like he'd had a plan told to him, instead of a problem. Evelyn looked up from her notes. "That's what I was trying to give him." Bess turned around. In the early lamplight, her face was older than it looked in daylight, the lines deeper, but the eyes were the same, sharp and dark and completely awake. "What do you need from me this week?" "Everything you can give me," Evelyn said honestly. "We need 30 barrels processed, sealed, staged, and ready to load by Sunday morning." Bess thought about it for about 3 seconds. "We'll need more cheesecloth for the ceiling. The supply in the storeroom won't stretch. Add it to the town list. Pete's going in this morning for salt anyway. And we'll need the second prep table set up in the barn. The kitchen's too small for the volume." "Already on my list." Evelyn turned back to the page. "Bess, thank you for this week and the last 5. Bess was quiet for a moment. Then, "You don't need to thank me for doing my job." "I'm not thanking you for doing your job. I'm thanking you for the way you do it." Evelyn met her eyes. "There's a difference." Bess looked at her for a moment. Then she turned back to the stove. "Kettle's almost ready," she said. But her shoulders had shifted somehow. Not softer exactly, but less braced against something. Pete came into the kitchen 40 minutes later and got his town list and his instructions and the carefully packed letter from Marcia's office, and he left before the sun had fully cleared the hills. Darnell and Coop began setting up the second prep table in the barn. Caleb arrived in the kitchen at 6, looked at the organized chaos of a production week beginning, and without being asked, rolled up his sleeves. "What do you need?" he said. "Can you manage the salting on the main line this morning while Bess and I handle the ceiling?" "Yes." "The ratio is 2 pounds of coarse salt to every 10 pounds of beef. I've written it on the board in the barn." "I know the ratio," he said, with the faintest edge of dryness that told her he had been ranching for 20 years and was aware of basic curing mathematics. "Of course you do," she said, without apology. "Go." He went. The week was the hardest Evelyn had worked since she arrived. Not because any single task was beyond her capacity, but because the pace was relentless and the stakes were clear and there was no margin for the ordinary small failures that punctuate every large effort. A split barrel on day 2 cost them 4 hours and 20 pounds of product. A problem with one of the salt supplies, a batch that had been contaminated with too much moisture and wouldn't cure properly, had to be identified, isolated, and replaced. On day 4, Coop cut his hand on a pry bar and had to be taken off production work for 2 days. None of these things stopped the work. They bent it. Evelyn adjusted the schedule twice, redistributed the labor, pulled longer hours on the days they fell behind. She was the last one in the barn each night and among the first ones there each morning, and she was aware that the men noticed this. Not with the resentment she might have expected, but with something that was beginning to look like respect. Darnell, who was 26 and had been at the ranch since before the drought, and who had stayed when most of the other workers left, came to her on day 5 with a question about the ceiling compound. "The stuff we've been using on the lids," he said. "My grandmother used to use something different. Mixed beeswax with tallow. Said it held better in temperature changes." Evelyn looked at him. "Where was your grandmother from?" "Missouri originally, then Kansas." "Did she have a specific ratio?" He thought. 2 parts beeswax to 1 part tallow, I think. She melted them together and brushed it on hot. Evelyn considered this. "Do we have beeswax?" "There's some in the tack room, left over from saddle work." "Get it," she said. "We'll test it on 6 barrels this afternoon. If the seal holds tighter through temperature change, we use it on the remaining production." Darnell got the beeswax. The seal held tighter. They used it on the remaining production. And something shifted in the barn after that. Something small and real. Darnell's grandmother's knowledge became part of the work. It made the work better. Evelyn noted it in her ledger as a process improvement and also noted in the private accounting she kept in her head that this was the kind of thing that mattered, making people's knowledge count, making them feel that what they knew was worth something. On Sunday morning, 31 barrels were staged and loaded on the wagon by 8 o'clock. Pete, Darnell, and a hired driver named Gus, who was passing through and agreed to work the Cheyenne run for day wages, pulled out of the ranch with the loaded wagon before the rest of the town was awake. Evelyn stood at the fence line and watched them go. Caleb stood beside her. Neither of them said anything for a while. "They'll make it in 3 days if the road's dry," Caleb said. "The road's been dry." "Could change." "It could," she agreed, "but we prepare for the road we have." He was quiet. Then, "If the payment clears before the end of the month, it will clear before the end of the month. The Cheyenne buyer has been reliable with Marsh's other clients. I confirmed it." She turned back toward the house. "Marsh sent a message yesterday afternoon, by the way. The injunction hearing has been scheduled for the 14th of next month." Caleb turned quickly. "He got it accelerated?" "He did." She kept walking. "He said the fact that Langley built a structure on your land, regardless of the water rights question, was sufficient grounds for an expedited hearing. The judge assigned is a man named Abernathy. Marsh says he has a reputation for impatience with encroachment cases." "What does that mean?" "It means he doesn't like people building things on other people's land and then arguing about it for years." She glanced back at him. "It means he tends to rule on the side of clear property rights and to rule quickly." Caleb absorbed this. "Langley's lawyers will argue for a delay. They'll try. Marsh says Abernathy has denied delay motions in 3 similar cases in the last 2 years. She pushed open the kitchen door. "Come in." Bess made porridge. He followed her in. The kitchen was warm and smelled of oats and wood smoke and the faint remaining tang of curing salt that had become the permanent scent of the place during the production week. Bess set bowls on the table without ceremony and sat down herself, which she had started doing about 2 weeks after Evelyn arrived, joining the morning meal instead of serving it. Evelyn had said nothing about this, just moved a chair to make room. Caleb had said nothing either, which told Evelyn something about the kind of man he was when you stripped away the anxiety and the pressure and the years of fighting. They ate in the comfortable silence of people who have worked hard together and don't need to fill every quiet moment with words. Then the back door opened and Pete came in, which made no sense because Pete had left for Cheyenne that morning with the wagon. Except it wasn't Pete. It was a man Evelyn hadn't seen before. Roughly Pete's age, with a long coat and a hat pulled low and mud on his boots that was fresh and heavy. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the 3 of them at the table. "I'm looking for Caleb Hawthorne," he said. "You found him," Caleb said. He had gone still in the careful way. The man reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "Message from Terrence Holt. He said to deliver it directly." He set it on the nearest counter, looked at Evelyn for a moment with an expression she couldn't read, and left without waiting to be dismissed. The kitchen was very quiet. Caleb stood up and got the envelope. He opened it standing at the counter. Evelyn watched his face as he read. She saw it go through several things: surprise, calculation, and then something that settled into hard anger. He handed her the letter without speaking. She read it. It took her about 90 seconds. When she finished, she set it on the table and looked at it for a moment the way you look at a thing that has confirmed your worst suspicion. "He's going after the East Quarter," Caleb said. His voice was flat. "He's claiming an encroachment in reverse," Evelyn said. "He's arguing that your new East Quarter fence line, the one Pete set last month, crosses into Langley's property by approximately 20 feet on the northeastern corner. That fence line follows the same boundary it's always followed." "I know." She looked at the letter. This isn't about the fence. This is his response to the injunction. He's filing a counterclaim. If he can establish any encroachment on your part, even a disputable one, he creates a parallel legal situation that complicates the injunction hearing." Caleb stared at her. He's trying to muddy the water. He's trying to make the injunction hearing about two parties with competing claims instead of one party with a clear grievance. She stood up. He's smart. I expected something like this, though not this specific thing. She moved to the shelf and took down the survey records she had been keeping. If the east quarter fence follows the same line, it's always followed. Do you have records of where that fence was set originally? From when we built it, Caleb thought. Maybe in the deed records from when my father bought the land. 1867. Where are those records? Strong box in the study. She was already moving toward the door. Get them. He got them. They spent the next 2 hours at the table with the deed records and the survey and the fence line documentation, and what they found was exactly what Evelyn had hoped they would find. A fence line established in the original deed survey of 1867 that matched exactly the line Pete had used last month, because Pete had used the original fence posts as his reference, and those posts had been in the ground for 17 years. "The fence follows the original deed line," she said. "Yes." Caleb's voice was tighter than it had been. "Which I know and Langley knows. But does he know you can prove it?" Caleb looked at the deed records. "He might not have expected us to have these in order." "No," Evelyn agreed. "He probably thought 17-year-old deed records would take time to locate, and time is what he's trying to buy." She gathered the papers carefully. "We sent copies of these to Marsh today. Not tomorrow. Today." "I'll ride to town myself." "Good." She looked at him. "And Caleb, when you're in town, don't discuss any of this with anyone. Not at the feed store, not at the saloon, not in passing. Whatever you're thinking, whatever you're angry about, keep it here until the hearing." His jaw was tight. "Langley's doing this deliberately." "Yes, he is." She met his eyes. "And the best response to a deliberate provocation is a deliberate response, not a reactive one." She held his gaze steadily. "You go to Marsh's office, you deliver the records, and you come home. That's all." He held the look for a moment. Then something in his face settled. "You're right," he said. "Not easily, but honestly." "I usually am," she said. "It's not a virtue. It's just a habit of thinking things through before I say them." She handed him the envelope with the copied records. "Go." He went. She stood in the kitchen after the sound of his horse had faded and allowed herself 30 seconds of sitting very still and thinking about Victor Langley, who she had still never met in person, and who was now on his third move in what was clearly a game he had been playing for years. The thing about a man who played the long game, Evelyn thought, was that he understood leverage. He understood patience. What he sometimes didn't understand was that patience was not his exclusive property. She picked up her ledger. She opened to a fresh page. She wrote across the top of it, "Langley's moves," documented, and began writing down every action Langley had taken in order with dates since she had arrived at Hawthorne Ranch. The bank pressure, the rumor campaign, the counterclaim on the fence line, 3 moves in 6 weeks. She looked at the list. 3 moves, all of which had produced documents, legal filings, correspondence, messenger deliveries. All of which were, in their own way, evidence of a campaign, evidence that a man with good legal counsel could present as a pattern of harassment. She made a note next to this observation. She underlined it. Then she turned to a fresh page and started outlining what she was beginning to think of as the production expansion. Because while Langley was maneuvering legally and politically, the actual work of the ranch had quarter rotation was producing results that exceeded her initial projection. The cattle weight was recovering faster than she'd estimated. The reprocessed barrels had sold at full price, and there was a buyer in Laramie. She had found him through a letter from her cousin Marta, who had heard through a supply chain contact, who was looking for a reliable salted beef source for a military contract he was managing. A military contract was a different kind of business than retail supply. It required consistency, documentation, and capacity. It required a producer who could commit to volume and deliver reliably. She had been turning this over in her mind for 2 weeks. Now she spread her notes on the table and began putting the numbers together in earnest. The east quarter rotation, fully implemented, would increase the herd's effective weight yield by approximately 15% over the next season. The storage buildings, with the north building repaired, could handle double the current production volume if they were properly organized. The Cheyenne supply contract was a foundation. The Laramie military contract was a potential ceiling, the kind of contract that, if secured, would change the financial picture of the ranch so completely that Langley's bank pressure would become meaningless. But to pursue it, she needed Caleb's agreement, because it would require investment. Modest investment, but investment. And it would require a formal business proposal, something she had the skills to write, but which needed his name and his endorsement. She was still working on the numbers when Caleb returned from town in the late afternoon. He came into the kitchen with the expression of a man who had accomplished what he'd set out to do and had something additional to report. She recognized the set of his shoulders. "Marsh got the records," he said. He paused like he was choosing the right words. He said the counterclaim is exactly the kind of thing Langley's lawyers do when they're trying to delay, and he said Abernathy has seen it before and doesn't appreciate it. Good. He also said, Caleb sat down and pulled off his hat. He said, there's something else we should know about Terrence Holt. Evelyn looked up. Holt has a reputation, not a good one. Caleb set his hat on the table. Marsh knows 3 other cases where Holt was hired by land buyers to pressure smaller landowners into selling. In 2 of those cases, the owner sold. In the third case, she prompted. The third case, the owner held on, and when it went to court, Holt's conduct during the pressure campaign was presented as evidence of bad faith negotiation. Caleb's eyes were steady on hers. The buyer lost the case, and he lost it partly because Holt's campaign was so documented and so clearly systematic that the judge found it amounted to coercion. The kitchen went very quiet. Marsh is suggesting we document everything, Evelyn said. He's suggesting we document everything and that I keep a written record of every approach, every letter, every messenger, every comment made in town that can be attributed to Langley or his representatives. Caleb looked at the ledger on the table, her ledger. I told him you'd already started. I started 2 weeks ago, she said. She turned to the ledger to face him and showed him the page with Langley's moves listed in order. Every action, every date, every witness who was present. Caleb read the page. He was quiet for a long time. Evelyn, he said. It may not be usable, she said quickly. Marsh would need to determine whether it rises to the legal standard. I'm not a lawyer. You keep saying that because it keeps being true. It keeps being true, he agreed, and you keep thinking like one. He looked at the page again. If Marsh can use this changes the shape of the hearing. It might, she said. It might not, but it costs us nothing to have it, and it would cost us considerably to not have it. She turned the ledger back toward her. There's something else I need to talk to you about. The Laramie contact, he said. She looked at him. How do you know about that? Marta wrote to you, and you wrote back. I saw the letter on the table. I didn't read it, he added quickly. But I saw the Laramie postmark on the return address. She studied him for a moment. Fair enough. Yes. The Laramie contact, a military supply contract. She laid out the numbers. She walked him through the east quarter projections, the storage capacity with the north building repaired, the volume requirement of the military contract, and what it would take to meet it. She was direct and specific, and she did not soften the difficulty of it. It would require work that went beyond anything they had done this season, and it would require capital they currently had in thin supply. He listened without interrupting. That was something she had come to rely on. His ability to hear a thing completely before he responded to it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. How confident are you in the east quarter projection? He said. At the current recovery rate, I'm confident in the baseline. The upper range depends on a wet spring, which I can't predict. And the north building, you think we can double the storage capacity with what we have? With the floor fixed and the drainage cleared and proper organization, yes, I've done the measurements. He looked at the table. Outside, the wind had come up again and the temperature was dropping, and somewhere one of the cattle in the east pen was making a low, repetitive sound. The capital, he said. You said it would require investment. A modest amount, new barrel stock, additional salt supply up front, a second drainage channel for the north building. She gave him the number. He nodded slowly. If the Cheyenne payment clears, and the Dunmore payment next month, we have it. Barely, but we have it. And if we pursue this contract and something goes wrong, we're in a worse position than we are now, she said, not softening it. I won't pretend otherwise. It's a risk. She met his eyes. But it's a calculated one, and the alternative is surviving this season and being in the same position next spring. Langley doesn't go away. Webb doesn't go away. The only way to make them irrelevant is to make the ranch financially beyond their reach. Caleb looked at her for a long time. She held the look because she always held looks. She had learned that looking away was the thing that made people think you weren't sure. Write the proposal, he said. To the Laramie contact, put your name on it as well as mine. She blinked, just slightly. That's not, it's unusual, he said. I know, but whoever this contact is, they should know who they're actually dealing with. He held her gaze. Put your name on it. She thought about that for a moment. About the weight of her name on a business proposal, about the rooms she had walked into over the years where her name and her size and her gender had all been used as reasons to dismiss what she was saying before she finished saying it. They may not respond well to a woman's name on the proposal, she said. Then they're not the right partner, Caleb said. Simply. The way he said simple things that weren't simple at all. She picked up her pencil. She began writing. Outside, the night was coming in fast and cold across the Wyoming plain, and somewhere to the north, Victor Langley was in a warm house being told by Terrence Holt that the counterclaim had been delivered and that the timeline was under control, and that a struggling ranch with a debt problem and a woman making decisions was nothing to lose sleep over. Langley agreed. He had seen this kind of thing before. He would wait. He was patient. He did not know about the ledger page with his name at the top. He did not know about the military contract proposal being written at a kitchen table 30 miles south of his property. He did not know about a surveyor named Eldon Fitch, whose careful measurements had already changed the shape of the legal argument twice. He did not know that the thing he had dismissed as nothing was, in fact, the thing that was going to be his problem. He found out in the morning. Not about all of it, not yet. But the morning brought a rider from Marsh's office with a formal notice that the injunction hearing date had been confirmed and that Abernathy had denied Langley's request for delay. The morning also brought word, via the same rider, that a written objection had been filed against Langley's fence line counterclaim. An objection supported by the original 1867 deed survey and 17 years of documented fence post positioning. Evelyn was in the barn when Caleb brought her the news. She was checking the seal on the remaining barrels, the ones not yet loaded for delivery. She looked up when he came in. Abernathy denied the delay, he said. She straightened up. Her back ached and her hands smelled of beeswax and her hair was not where she had put it that morning. And the counterclaim objection? Filed and accepted. Marsh says the judge will rule on it before the injunction hearing. She turned back to the barrel she had been checking. She pressed the lid firmly with both hands, testing the seal. Good, she said. That's all? Good? What would you like me to say? Something, he said. Something that indicates this is working. She looked at him over her shoulder. He was standing in the barn doorway with morning light behind him and the expression of a man who needed to hear that the thing he had begun to believe in was not going to fall apart. She understood that need. She had felt it herself, in other forms, in other difficult seasons. It's working, she said. It isn't finished, and it isn't safe yet, and Langley isn't done, but it's working. She turned back to the barrel. Now, help me with this stack. The seal on the third barrel from the left is loose and I need another pair of hands. He came in. He pushed up his sleeves. He helped with the barrel. And the morning continued the way it had been continuing since Evelyn Carter arrived at Hawthorne Ranch. One task at a time, one problem addressed and then the next, with no fanfare and no guarantee and no version of this that was easy. Just the work. The relentless, necessary, quietly revolutionary work of a woman who refused to be finished. The Cheyenne payment cleared on a Thursday. Pete came back from the delivery run with Darnell and the hired driver Gus, rode dusty and tired in the way of men who had pushed hard for 3 days, and he brought with him a signed receipt and a bank draft that Evelyn held in both hands for a moment before she handed it to Caleb. Caleb looked at it. He didn't say anything right away. He just looked at it the way a man looks at something he had stopped letting himself believe in. That's the full contracted amount, Evelyn said. No deductions, no disputes. The buyer signed the receipt on delivery as instructed. I see that. The moment that draft clears the Blackthorn Valley Bank, Holt's pending delivery argument is finished. She took the draft back gently. I want to deposit it today. Not tomorrow, today. Caleb looked up. Webb will see it. That's exactly why we deposited today. He reached for his hat. She was already moving toward the door. They rode into town together, which they had not done before. Evelyn was aware of the particular quality of attention that followed them down the main street. The slowed movements of people on the boardwalk, the woman outside the dress shop who stopped mid-conversation to watch them pass. She kept her eyes forward and her posture the way she always kept it, which was straight and unhurried, and she did not give the watching the dignity of acknowledgement. Clarence Webb was at his desk when they came in. He looked up and his expression went through a quick sequence of things: surprise at seeing them together, then a more careful blankness when he saw what Evelyn was carrying. "Mr. Webb," she said. She set the draft and the signed delivery receipt on his desk. "We'd like to make a deposit." Webb looked at the draft. He looked at the receipt. He picked up the receipt and read it, slowly, in the manner of a man hoping to find something wrong with it. He didn't find anything wrong with it. "This clears the first contracted delivery," Evelyn said. "We have 2 additional deliveries scheduled this season under the same contract. I have the signed contract documentation here as well, if the bank would like a copy for its records." She produced it from the folder she'd brought. "The Dunmore payment is expected within the month. The hotel contract in Casper begins next quarter." Webb set the receipt down. He was quiet for a moment. "That's good news for the ranch," he said. His voice had the careful neutrality of a man who had committed to a position and was now watching it get complicated. "It is," Evelyn agreed. "We thought you should know directly." She smiled at him. Not a warm smile, a precise one. The kind that said, "I see exactly what you did, and I'm giving you the opportunity to choose differently now." Webb looked at Caleb. Caleb said nothing. He had learned in the past weeks that there were moments when saying nothing was the more powerful choice, and he had gotten better at recognizing them. "I'll process this today," Webb said finally. "Thank you," Evelyn said. She gathered her folder and turned for the door. She heard Webb say behind her quietly, probably not meant for her, "Where did he find her?" She didn't turn around. She pushed through the door and stepped out onto the boardwalk into the mid-morning air, and after a moment, Caleb came out behind her and stood beside her. "That went well," he said. "It went exactly as expected," she said. "Shall we go?" The injunction hearing was 12 days away. Those 12 days were the kind that moved both too fast and too slowly. Fast because there was always more work than hours. Slow because every evening Evelyn sat with Marcia's letters and her documented ledger and thought about Abernathy and what a judge who disliked encroachment cases would need to see. Marsh had been clear. The physical evidence was strong. The survey was authenticated. The fence line counterclaim had been substantially weakened by the deed records. What Marsh wanted, additionally, was testimony. Someone who could speak to the ongoing impact of the water diversion on Hawthorne Ranch's operation. Someone with documented knowledge of the ranch's water access history and the measurable effect of losing the tributary. "He wants you to testify," Caleb said, reading the letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening. He set it down and looked at her. "He says your documented records of the ranch's financial condition, combined with your knowledge of the production losses traceable to the water access issue, make you the strongest factual witness he has." Evelyn looked at the letter. "I'm not a party to the deed. I've only been here 11 weeks. Marsh says that works in our favor. He says a witness who arrived recently with fresh eyes and documented what she found is harder to impeach than someone who's been here for years and might be argued to have a personal stake in the outcome." Caleb paused. "He also says you're—" He stopped. "What does he say?" Caleb looked faintly uncomfortable. "He says you present as credible. He means I don't present as what people expect when Caleb Hawthorne's wife is mentioned." A pause. "He didn't say that. He didn't need to." She took the letter and read it herself. Marsh's language was careful and legal and exactly what he'd meant. She was, according to Gideon Marsh, an unexpectedly powerful witness because no one would anticipate her to be. That was the truth of it, dressed in professional language. She had spent her entire adult life being underestimated. She had learned to use it. This was simply a formal version of the same thing. "I'll testify," she said. "Tell Marsh I'll need 3 days to prepare my documentation for presentation." Caleb nodded. He watched her for a moment. "Are you worried about it? Standing up in court in front of—" "I'm not going to perform worry for you," she said. Not sharply, just clearly. "I'm cautious about it. That's different." She set the letter down. "I don't know, Judge Abernathy. I don't know how he receives a woman testifying on financial matters. I don't know whether Holt is going to try to discredit me personally rather than challenge the evidence." She met Caleb's eyes. "All of those are real concerns. But the alternative to testifying is not having our strongest evidence presented well, and that's a worse concern." He was quiet. "Holt might go after you personally. He might. He's the kind of man who does that, who finds the The thing that makes people feel uncertain about a witness. The thing that makes the judge look twice. She understood what he was not saying directly, and she appreciated that he was not saying it directly because it showed a form of delicacy she hadn't expected from him. "You mean my size," she said. "He might use it. Or you're being a woman, or you're not being from here. He'll pick the angle that plays best in the room." "I know." She looked at him steadily. "I've been in rooms where all of those things were used against me simultaneously. I'm still here." He held her gaze for a moment, then he said quietly, "What can I do?" It was such a plain, genuine question that it stopped her for a second. Not because she didn't expect him to offer help. She had learned that he was that kind of man. But because of the particular simplicity of it. Not "let me handle it," or "I'll talk to Marsh about whether you really need to," or any of the forms of help that were actually forms of removal. Just, "What can I do? Help me organize the financial documentation tonight," she said. "I need to sort it chronologically and by category. 2 sets of eyes are faster than 1. "All right." He pulled his chair closer to the table. They worked until nearly midnight, spreading the ledger records and the surveyor's reports and the correspondence with buyers across the kitchen table in the lamplight. Bess brought coffee at 10 o'clock without being asked and then went to bed. Caleb was methodical and remembered details better than she'd expected. He could look at a ledger page and tell her exactly which season a particular expense related to, which was useful when she needed to establish the timeline of losses. By the time they finished, the documentation was organized into 4 categories: water access history, production losses attributable to the access reduction, the financial recovery trajectory since her arrival, and the comparative valuation of the ranch with and without the disputed tributary restored. She looked at the stacked pages. "This is a good case," she said. "Marsh's case," Caleb said. "Marsh's legal argument. Our evidence." She looked at him. He couldn't make this case without what we've built here. Caleb looked at the table, at the weeks of work laid out in organized pages, at the thing they had built in 11 weeks from what had been, when she arrived, a ranch losing ground in 4 directions at once. "No," he said. He couldn't. He picked up his coffee. She picked up hers. The lamp had burned lower, and outside the night was completely still. The kind of stillness that comes when the temperature drops fast and the air runs out of the energy for wind. "Evelyn," he said. She looked at him. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly, even if the honest answer is complicated." She waited. "When your trial period ends," the original arrangement was 3 months. He looked at his coffee. "That's in 4 weeks. And I know the situation has changed from what either of us expected when you answered the advertisement." He paused. "I'm not good at saying things like this directly." "You're doing reasonably well," she said. He looked up. Something that was almost a smile. "I am asking whether you want to stay. Past the 3 months. Not only as someone who manages the production and the accounts." He met her eyes. "I'm asking whether you want to stay as my wife, actually, not as an arrangement." The kitchen was very quiet. Evelyn looked at him for a moment, at the man across the table from her. Not a simple man, not an uncomplicated man, a man with grief still visible around the edges of him and years of difficulty in the lines of his face. A man who carried his own freight and followed through and told the truth about hard things when most men found ways to avoid them. "That's not a simple question," she said. "I know, and I'm not going to answer it like it's simple." She set her coffee down. "What I want and what makes sense are sometimes different things. And I've spent a lot of years making decisions based on what makes sense." "What does sense tell you?" "That this ranch needs stability, that the arrangement we have is working, that changing the terms of it introduces a new kind of uncertainty at exactly the moment when we can't afford new uncertainties." She looked at him evenly. "That's what sense tells me." He nodded slowly. "And the other thing?" She was quiet for a moment. "The other thing tells me that I've spent 11 weeks working beside a man who has never once, in all of that time, made me feel like my size was a problem he was tolerating, who has never once suggested I should be doing something smaller than what I'm actually capable of." She paused. "That's rarer than it should be." Caleb held her gaze. "So what's the answer?" "The answer is yes," she said, "but I want it said clearly. This is a partnership. What I contribute to this ranch isn't secondary to what you contribute. We decide things together." "I know that already. I want it said out loud." "Then I'm saying it out loud." He met her eyes. "Partners." She nodded. "Partners." A pause. Now go to bed. The hearing is in 12 days and we both need to be sharp. He laughed. A real one this time. Not the surprised, reluctant kind, but something fully present. He picked up his hat from the chair. Good night, Evelyn. Good night, Caleb. She sat for a moment after he left, looking at the organized documentation on the table. She didn't allow herself to feel too much about the conversation they'd just had, because she had learned that feeling too much about things before they were finished was a way of spending energy you needed for the work. But she allowed herself a moment of something that was quiet and warm and not quite happiness, but was in that direction. Then she turned down the lamp and went to bed. The hearing was on a Tuesday. They rode to Laramie the day before and stayed at a boarding house Marsh had arranged. Evelyn in her room, Caleb in his, and Marsh himself arriving at 7 in the evening to go over the testimony preparation one more time. Marsh was a thin, precise man in his 50s with a good legal mind and the particular manner of someone who had learned to be cautious about optimism. He went through the documentation with Evelyn for 2 hours and asked her questions in the style she recognized as cross-examination preparation, pointed, occasionally aggressive, looking for the places where her answers might be inconsistent. She was consistent. She knew the numbers. She had written the numbers down. Holt will try to establish that you have a personal interest in the outcome, Marsh said, because of the proposed marriage arrangement. The arrangement is factual, Evelyn said. I won't deny it. He'll argue it biases your testimony. Bias requires that I'm presenting something other than documented fact. The documents speak for themselves. I'm simply providing the context that makes them readable. She looked at Marsh steadily. If Holt wants to argue that the drainage channel measurements are wrong because I have a personal interest, he needs to argue with Eldon Fitch, not with me. Marsh looked at her for a moment. Have you testified before? No. He made a sound that might have been approval. You'll be fine, he said, which from Marsh, who did not traffic in comfort, was a substantial assessment. The courtroom, the next morning, was smaller than Evelyn had expected. Abernathy was a compact man of about 60 with a gray beard and the focused impatience Marsh had described, and he came in without ceremony and moved things along briskly from the start. Langley's legal team was 3 men, Holt and 2 others whose names Evelyn didn't catch. Langley himself was there, sitting in the gallery on the respondent's side. Evelyn looked at him once. He was about 60, heavy-set, with the groomed confidence of a man who had been the largest thing in every room he'd walked into for 30 years. He was looking at her with an expression that she had seen before, the particular assessment of someone trying to find the weakness by looking at the surface. She looked away. She had work to do. Marsh presented the injunction case in clean, specific terms, the survey evidence, the 14-foot encroachment, the authenticated deed boundary. Holt's team objected 3 times in the first hour. Abernathy overruled all 3 objections with the efficiency of a man who had heard them before. Evelyn was called to testify at 11 o'clock. She walked to the stand without rushing. She was aware of the room in the way she was always aware of rooms. The disposition of the people in it, the quality of the attention. She could feel Langley watching from the gallery. Marsh took her through the documentation carefully. She answered each question with the same measured directness she brought to everything. Specific, factual, sourced. She referenced the ledger pages by date and category. She described the production losses in terms of documented volume and market price. She explained the water flow measurements at the tributary junction and what the reduction in flow had meant for the East Quarter pasture. She was on the stand for 40 minutes before Holt stood up. He was a smooth man. She had expected smooth. He had the practiced ease of someone who was very good at making juries and judges see what he wanted them to see. And he started with a series of questions that were ostensibly about clarifying details, but were actually about establishing that she was new to the property and therefore limited in her knowledge. You've been at Hawthorne Ranch for approximately 11 weeks, is that correct? He said. That's correct. And before that, you were employed as a cook at a boarding house in Columbus, Ohio. I was a cook and also managed the accounts and household operations for the boarding house. A boarding house, he said, with a particular inflection that was not quite contempt but was adjacent to it. And you've testified about the ranch's financial operations as though you have significant expertise in cattle ranching specifically. I've testified about what the documented records show, she said. The expertise required is the ability to read and understand the records accurately. I have that expertise. You've been on this ranch for 11 weeks. Yes. And the records I've described cover the 3 years prior to my arrival. I didn't generate those records. I read them and organized them. The information in them predates my presence. Holt shifted slightly. He had expected, she thought, that she would be more easily rattled. He moved to a different angle. You've recently entered into a proposed marital arrangement with the plaintiff. We've discussed a permanent arrangement, yes, which gives you a direct financial interest in the outcome of this hearing. It gives me an interest in the outcome. Every piece of evidence presented in this room was documented before any marital arrangement was discussed. The survey work was done by a licensed surveyor. The financial records were reviewed by Mr. Marsh. My testimony describes documented facts, not interpretations colored by personal interest. She paused. If you'd like to challenge the accuracy of any specific document, I'm happy to address that. There was a brief silence. Holt tried 2 more angles. She answered both with the same directness. Specific, sourced, unbothered. She was not performing unbothered. She was actually unbothered because the facts were the facts and she knew them better than anyone in the room. When Holt sat down, Abernathy looked at his notes for a moment. Then he looked at Evelyn. You compiled the water flow measurements yourself? He said. I initiated the documentation protocol, yes. The measurements were taken by myself and by Pete Aldridge, a Hawthorne Ranch employee, on a regular schedule over 8 weeks. Each measurement is dated and initialed by both parties. Abernathy looked at the measurement record in the documentation. And the tributary flow reduction you've described, you're attributing this entirely to the Langley Dam? The flow reduction correlates precisely with the installation of the dam according to the timeline in the survey records. The tributary has no other obstructions between the Langley boundary and the Hawthorne property. I can't speak to engineering causation. I'm not an engineer. The correlation in the documented record is exact. Abernathy looked at her for another moment. Then he made a note. He had the expression of a man who had made up his mind about something. Holt made one final argument before the hearing concluded, a procedural objection about the timeline of the Survey Commission. Abernathy listened to it with the patience of a man finishing a task and then denied it in the same breath. The encroachment is documented, authenticated, and legally established, Abernathy said. The injunction is granted. The respondent is ordered to remove the diversion structure from the plaintiff's property within 30 days. The fence line counterclaim is dismissed for insufficient grounds. Cost to the respondent. He closed his file. Court adjourned. The room came back to itself slowly. Marsh touched Caleb's arm and said something quiet. Holt's team was in a fast, low conference. Evelyn sat in the witness area for a moment because her legs needed a moment and because she wanted to feel the weight of what had just happened before she stood up and moved through the rest of the day. She looked across the room at Victor Langley. He was standing, and his face had gone through the surprise stage and arrived somewhere that was harder and more calculating. He was already, she could see, thinking about what came next. Men like Langley didn't stop. She knew that. This was one battle in a longer war, and she was not foolish enough to think otherwise. But it was a battle they had won, clearly, documentably, in a courtroom with a judge who had said the words aloud. Caleb appeared at her elbow. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder, just for a moment, without a word, and then removed it. She stood up. Marsh wants to brief us in the hallway, she said. I know. Are you all right? I'm fine. She gathered her folder. The 30-day removal order. We need to be monitoring the tributary junction from day 1. Langley will comply because he has to, but I want measurements before and after to document the restoration of flow. Caleb looked at her for a second with the expression he sometimes had of discovering again what he already knew. Of course you do, he said. Pete can manage the measurements. Eldon Fitch should do a formal verification at completion. She moved toward the door. We should also send a copy of the ruling to Clarence Webb today, not tomorrow. Today, Caleb agreed. They walked out into the hallway where Marsh was waiting, and behind them in the courtroom, Victor Langley said something short and hard to Holt, and Holt nodded once with the careful nod of a man being given instructions about the next move in a game that was not over. Marsh was smiling in his careful, cautious way. You handled yourself very well in there, he said to Evelyn. The documentation handled itself, she said. We just put it in order. Don't minimize it, Marsh said. Abernathy asked you a direct question from the bench. That's unusual. It means you establish credibility with him independently of my argument. He paused. Langley's going to regroup. The removal order buys us 30 days of disruption to his plans. We should use them. We're already using them, Evelyn said. Marsh looked at her. The Laramie contract? We submitted the proposal last week, Caleb said. We're waiting on a response. If that comes through... When that comes through, Evelyn said, the ranch's financial position changes substantially. The spring note becomes manageable without Webb's cooperation, which means Langley's leverage at the bank effectively disappears. Marsh nodded slowly. And if it doesn't come through, then we proceed with the existing contracts and refinance through a different institution if Webb moves against us. She met his eyes. I've already made preliminary inquiries with a bank in Laramie. They've expressed interest in the account. Marsh stared at her. Then he looked at Caleb. Where did you find her? Caleb said, without missing a beat. She found me. The ride back to Blackthorn Valley took the better part of the afternoon. They rode mostly in the comfortable quiet that had become their ordinary mode of travel together, not because they had nothing to say, but because they had learned that silence between people who trust each other is not an absence of something but a presence. About halfway home, Caleb said, "The Laramie response. You said when, not if." "Yes. You know something I don't." She considered this. Marta's contact, the man who holds the military contract, wrote back with follow-up questions about our production capacity. That's not what people do when they're not interested. He asked follow-up questions. 3 specific follow-up questions about delivery reliability, salt sourcing, and whether we could scale to a larger volume in the second season. She looked at him. Those are the questions of someone who is negotiating terms, not evaluating whether to engage. Caleb was quiet for a moment. When did you get those questions? 4 days ago. Oh, and you answered them? I answered them 2 days ago, in detail, with the revised production schedule attached. She paused. I was going to tell you this evening. He looked at her with an expression she had come to recognize. The one that contained both exasperation and something warmer than exasperation. The particular look of a person who has stopped being surprised by someone and started being grateful for them instead. You are going to tell me this evening. There was the hearing to manage first. I didn't want you thinking about the Laramie contract during the testimony preparation. She kept her eyes on the road. One thing at a time. One thing at a time, he repeated. Something in his voice. Evelyn. You managed the hearing testimony, the Laramie correspondence, the web deposit, and the ongoing production schedule simultaneously, and you're telling me you did it one thing at a time. I did it one decision at a time, she corrected. The decisions are sequential even when the tasks are parallel. He shook his head slowly, not with frustration, with something that had moved well past admiration into a territory she didn't quite have a name for. Partners, he said. Partners, she confirmed. They rode into Blackthorn Valley as the late afternoon light was flattening across the main street, turning everything amber and quiet. The feed store men were closing up. The dress shop was dark. A few people on the boardwalk looked up as they passed, the same people who had watched Evelyn arrive 11 weeks ago with their opinions already formed and their conclusions already drawn. One of them, a man she vaguely recognized from an early trip to the general store, lifted his hand in a small wave to Caleb. Then, after a half-second pause, he lifted it in her direction too. It was nothing. A small gesture, a hand raised and lowered. She nodded back at him and kept riding. But she noted it, the way she noted everything, the way something can shift in a community so quietly. You almost miss it, the way the angle of the light changes over a long afternoon so gradually you don't see it happening. Only notice suddenly that the world looks different than it did this morning. The ranch came into view around the long curve in the road, and Pete was visible at the far end of the cattle pens doing something with a fence post, and smoke was coming from the kitchen chimney because Bess had seen them coming and had started the stove. Caleb pulled up at the gate. He looked at the ranch, at all of it, in the particular way you look at something you've been afraid of losing. And then he looked at Evelyn. I want to write to the Laramie contact tomorrow, he said. Directly. From me. Separate from your production letter. What would you say? That Hawthorne Ranch stands behind everything in that proposal. That whoever wrote it speaks for the operation and the operation stands behind her. He met her eyes. Something like that. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked away, back at the ranch, at the smoke from the kitchen chimney, and Pete at the fence line and the east quarter just visible beyond the outbuildings, recovering, coming back. Better than it had looked when she arrived. Something like that would be appropriate, she said. She dismounted. She handed her reins to Pete, who had jogged over when he saw them arrive, and she walked toward the kitchen door because Bess would have food ready, and they had not eaten since morning, and there was still the web copy of the ruling to draft and send before the day was done. Behind her, she heard Caleb dismount and say something to Pete about the east quarter fence, and Pete's reply, and the ordinary sounds of the ranch reassembled themselves around her. The cattle, the wind, the wood smoke, the creak of the gate. She pushed open the kitchen door. Bess was at the stove. She looked up when Evelyn came in, and her eyes asked the question. "We won," Evelyn said simply. Bess turned back to the stove. She stirred whatever was in the pot. After a moment, she said, without turning around, "Sit down. You've been up since before 5, and you haven't eaten, and you look like you're running on nothing." Evelyn sat down. She pulled her folder onto the table and opened it and found the page she needed to draft the web copy. Her hand was steadier than it had been in the courtroom, which was interesting. She had been steadier in the courtroom than she'd expected, and steadier now than she had a right to be given how much still depended on things she couldn't control. But that was the nature of the work. You did what you could do, as well as you could do it, and then you waited to see what the world made of your effort. She had been doing that her entire life. She picked up her pencil. Outside, the afternoon was going toward evening, and the light was changing over the Wyoming plain, and somewhere in a house to the north, Victor Langley was sitting with Terrence Holt and rethinking his plan. And somewhere in Laramie, a man with a military contract was looking at a production proposal with 3 follow-up questions already answered in precise and specific detail. And in the kitchen of Hawthorne Ranch, Evelyn Carter was drafting a letter to a bank because the day was not finished, and neither was she. The letter from Laramie came on a Monday morning, 9 days after the hearing. Pete brought it in from the post with the rest of the week's mail and set it on the kitchen table without ceremony. But Evelyn recognized the return address before he had fully let go of it. She picked it up and held it for a moment without opening it, which was unusual for her. She was not a woman who prolonged uncertainty unnecessarily. But this particular envelope contained something that could change the shape of everything, and she had learned over the years that there were moments worth pausing in before you moved through them, because you didn't always get to know in advance which moments those were. Caleb came in from the barn 20 minutes later and saw her at the table with the unopened letter in front of her and the coffee she had poured and not drunk going cold beside it. He stopped. "Is that the Laramie letter?" "Yes." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He didn't tell her to open it. He just sat down and waited with her, which was the right thing to do and which she noticed. She opened it. It was 2 pages. The first page was formal. Contract language, delivery schedule, pricing structure. The second page was a handwritten note from the contact himself, a man named Harlan Cross who managed procurement for a regional military supply operation and who wrote in the direct, no-waste style of someone who had spent years dealing with people who said one thing and delivered another. He wrote that the proposal had been the most clearly documented supply offer he had received in 4 years of procurement work. He wrote that the production schedule was realistic, which he could tell because it accounted for variables that most suppliers ignored. He wrote that he was prepared to offer a 2-year contract at the volume specified with a 30% increase option at the 12-month mark if the first year's delivery record supported it. He wrote, at the bottom of the handwritten note, "I don't care who wrote the proposal. I care that whoever wrote it knows what they're talking about. This one does." Evelyn set the letter down on the table and looked at it. Caleb had been reading it with her, leaning slightly forward, and when she set it down, he sat back in his chair and was quiet for a moment. 2 years, he said, with a 30% increase option. At year 12 months, if the delivery record supports it. She looked at him. It will support it. He looked at the letter, then at her, then at the letter again, the way people look back and forth between 2 things they're trying to hold in their minds at once. Evelyn, this changes everything, she said. "Yes, I know." He stood up. He walked to the window, which he sometimes did when he was feeling something strongly and didn't know what to do with it physically. He stood there for a moment looking out at the east quarter, which was green now, properly green, the cattle moving through it with the unhurried ease of animals that had enough to eat. "The spring note," he said, "met from the first quarterly payment with enough remaining to begin the second storage building expansion." She had already done these numbers. She had done them the night before, in the private hours after midnight when she sometimes worked best, when the ranch was quiet and she could think without interruption. "The bank in Laramie, the one I made preliminary inquiries with, is prepared to take the account if Webb makes any further movement. But with this contract in place, Webb has no grounds for pressure. The note is no longer a vulnerability. Langley loses his leverage. Langley lost his leverage in the courtroom. This removes the last theoretical backup position he had." She looked at Caleb's back, at the set of his shoulders, which had changed in the months since she arrived, lost some of the braced quality they'd had when she first saw him on the station platform. "We should respond to Cross today. Formal acceptance, signed by both of us." He turned from the window. "Both of us. Both of us," she said. "This is a partnership. The contract should reflect that." He crossed to the table. He picked up the letter and read the handwritten note again, the part at the bottom. Then he set it down carefully, the way you set down something you want to keep intact. He said he didn't care who wrote it. He cared that whoever wrote it knew what they were talking about. Yes, he has no idea you're... Caleb stopped. A heavy woman from Ohio who was hired to make salted beef? She said it without heat, just accurately. I was going to say remarkable, Caleb said, but those other things are also true. She looked at him for a moment. Go get Bess, she said. She should know. He went to the bottom of the stairs and called up. Bess appeared within 2 minutes in her house clothes, hair not yet properly pinned, which meant she'd heard the particular quality of the morning's quiet and had been waiting. She came to the table. She read the letter, both pages. She set it down. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said to Evelyn, I'm going to make a proper breakfast, not porridge, actual breakfast. Evelyn almost smiled. That seems appropriate. Bess went to the stove. The response to Harlan Cross went out that same afternoon, signed by Caleb Hawthorne and Evelyn Carter Hawthorne. The latter name used for the first time formally, which felt like a different kind of statement than the quiet conversation in the kitchen 11 weeks ago. They had married in a brief civil ceremony the week after the hearing, witnessed by Marsh and Bess in the office of a county clerk in Laramie who had processed the paperwork with the efficiency of a man who married people every week and found each one unremarkable. The ceremony had taken 11 minutes. Evelyn had worn her best dress, which was dark blue and well-made and suited her. Caleb had worn his good coat. Bess had cried, which surprised everyone, including Bess. They had not made a production of it in Blackthorn Valley. They had not needed to. The town had begun to understand, slowly and in pieces, that the situation at Hawthorne Ranch had changed in ways that were not going to reverse themselves. The first indication had been the East Quarter cattle. When ranchers who knew their stock saw animals that had been underweight coming back to proper condition, it meant something concrete and visible. Cattlemen understood weight recovery. They understood what it meant for the operation that had achieved it. The second indication had been the Dunmore contract. Old Hector Dunmore was not a man who signed contracts with operations he didn't believe in. He was frugal and careful and had been ranching in the valley for 30 years. When word got around that Dunmore had committed to a regular salted beef supply agreement with Hawthorne Ranch, people who had been quietly waiting to see what happened made quieter revisions to their assessments. The third indication was the injunction ruling. That was public record, documented in the county courthouse, and it said in plain legal language that Victor Langley had built a structure 14 feet inside Hawthorne Ranch's property line and had been ordered to remove it. Legal rulings have a particular weight in communities built on land ownership. Land is what people in those communities understand most fundamentally, and a ruling that said someone had taken land, even 14 feet of it, and had been compelled to give it back, said something about the character of the parties involved that no amount of social influence could easily undo. Langley's men removed the diversion gate on the 28th day of the 30-day order, not the 30th, the 28th. Evelyn thought this was interesting. A man who took the extra 2 days would be a man still making a point. A man who moved 2 days early was a man who wanted it done and the attention off of it. She noted it. She continued monitoring the tributary flow with Pete and documented the restoration of water access to the East Quarter with the same methodical precision she had brought to everything else. On the day the measurements confirmed full tributary flow restoration, Pete looked at the water running clear and strong through the channel and said, "Huh," as if he had not quite believed it would actually happen until he saw it. "Write down the measurement," Evelyn said. "Yes, ma'am." He wrote it down. She sent a copy to Marsh and a copy to the county surveyor's office and kept the original in the operations ledger under a tab she had labeled, in her precise handwriting, "Resolved." The word gave her a quiet satisfaction she allowed herself briefly before moving on to the next item. The next item was the storage expansion. The north building had been repaired in the first month. Floor replaced, drainage redirected, foundations sealed. That had been the emergency work. What Evelyn had been planning since approximately week 3 was the longer project, a third storage building, positioned to take advantage of the natural temperature differential on the north slope of the ranch property, which would provide better ambient curing conditions than either existing building. She had sketched the design herself, rough but functional, based on the same principles her uncle's farm in Indiana had used. Principles she'd understood since she was 19 years old and had never had the resources or the authority to fully implement. She had the resources now. She had the authority now. She presented the design to Caleb on a Thursday evening, laid out on the kitchen table with measurements and material estimates and a projected completion timeline. He studied it for a long time. He asked 3 questions, all of them practical and good, and she answered them. He asked whether Pete could manage the construction supervision with external help. Pete can manage the framing, she said. We'll need a carpenter for the structural elements. Darnell has experience with postwork. I've already spoken to both of them. He looked at the design again. This is the building you've been planning since we started. Since week 3, she confirmed. He looked at her. You've been patient. Things have to happen in the right order, she said. The floor first, then the East Quarter, then the legal situation, then the Laramie contract, and then this. She tapped the design. The 3rd building is what makes us a large-scale operation instead of a recovering one. There's a difference. A significant one. Recovering operations are still vulnerable. Large-scale operations have a buffer. She met his eyes. I want us to have a buffer. He looked at the plans for another moment. Then he picked up the pencil she'd set beside them and made a single notation. A slight adjustment to the placement of the access door that would make loading easier from the wagon approach angle. A practical, good adjustment. He handed the pencil back. Build it, he said. Construction began the following week. The building went up over the course of 6 weeks, with interruptions for weather and for the ongoing production work, which did not slow down for construction because the Laramie contract schedule was fixed and Evelyn was not a person who let a fixed schedule slip. Pete managed the construction site in the mornings and helped with production runs in the afternoons. Darnell turned out to have more structural knowledge than he had mentioned, which Evelyn suspected was because he hadn't been asked the right questions before. She asked the right questions and put the knowledge to use. On the 3rd week of construction, a neighboring rancher named Thomas Bray rode over and stood at the fence line watching the framing go up for about 20 minutes before he knocked at the main house door. He asked for Caleb. Bess showed him to the kitchen, where both Caleb and Evelyn were reviewing the week's production numbers. Bray was about 50, a lean, careful man who ran 300 head on the property east of Dunmore's. He had never said anything directly unkind about Evelyn, which in the economy of small-town judgment was not the same as having been supportive, but was at least a position of maintained neutrality. He sat down at the table with his hat in his hands and looked at the building going up outside the window and said, I've been having a problem with my storage. Lost nearly 40% of my salted stock last winter to moisture damage. I've been trying to figure out why. Evelyn looked at him. How old is your storage building? 12 years. Built on the east side of the main barn. East side? She repeated. Does it get morning sun directly on the east wall? He thought. Yes. The temperature differential between the sun-warmed east wall and the shaded interior creates condensation cycling, particularly in early winter when the night temperatures drop fast and the day temperatures are still variable. She set down her pencil. It's not your preparation or your salt ratios. It's the building placement working against the preservation conditions. Bray stared at her. How do you fix that? She spent 40 minutes with him going through the options. Some structural, some management-based, some as simple as adjusting when he opened the building for access to minimize condensation introduction. She drew a quick diagram of the temperature flow problem. She told him what she would do if it were her building. When he left, he shook Evelyn's hand before he shook Caleb's. He probably didn't notice he'd done it in that order. She noticed. He was not the last neighbor to come by. Over the following 2 months, 3 other ranchers in the valley found reasons to visit Hawthorne Ranch, and most of those visits ended at the kitchen table with Evelyn talking through some version of a production or management problem. She gave information freely, because information hoarded helped only the person holding it, and information shared built the kind of community that could sustain itself through the hard seasons that came for everyone eventually. Caleb watched this happen with an expression she had come to recognize as his version of wonder, the quiet, not quite smiling look of a man who kept finding the world different from what he'd planned. You're building something outside the ranch, he said to her one evening after Bray had stopped by for the second time with a follow-up question. I'm answering questions, she said. You're building relationships, he said. Practical ones, the kind that matter when you need something. She looked at him. That's the same thing. He considered this. I suppose it is. When we go to scale up the Laramie contract at the 12-month mark, she said, we may need more processing capacity than this ranch alone can provide on short notice. If I have relationships with 3 or 4 neighboring ranchers who trust the operation and understand the quality standards we maintain, you can bring them in as suppliers, he said slowly. Or as partners in a production cooperative, she said, which is a different thing and a stronger one. She looked at him. I've been thinking about this since month 2. He shook his head. not with frustration, with the particular affection of someone who had given up being surprised and was now simply glad. "Of course you have," he said. Victor Langley made one more move. It came about 2 months after the injunction ruling, in the form of a revised offer on the north parcel, higher than his previous offers, structured attractively, delivered through an intermediary rather than through Holt, which told Evelyn that Langley had assessed the legal situation and concluded that his direct pressure campaign had run its course. Caleb brought her the offer without having opened it. That had become their practice. Correspondence that concerned the ranch came to the table and they read it together. She read it, she set it down. "He's changed tactics," she said. "He's making a real offer now," Caleb said. "Not pressure, an actual purchase offer." "He is." The offer was fair by market standards. Not generous, but fair. He still wants the land. He's just decided that the method he was using isn't going to work. "What do you want to do?" She looked at the offer. "The north parcel has the best access to the rebuilt tributary. It's the parcel that makes the difference between us being able to sustain the Laramie contract long-term and being stretched thin in dry years." She met Caleb's eyes. "What do you want to do?" He had looked at it already. She could tell. He had the expression of a man who has already made up his mind, but wanted to make sure he and his partner were making the same mind. "I want to tell him no," he said, not with anger, just no. "Then we tell him no," she said. They sent a 1-paragraph reply, polite, definitive, and without any invitation to negotiate further. Evelyn drafted it. Caleb signed it. She never heard from Victor Langley directly again. His operation continued to the north, as it had always continued, and the Hawthorne Ranch continued to the south, and the 14 feet of land where the diversion gate had stood was now empty and the water ran through it the way water runs through places where it belongs. The third storage building was completed in early spring. On the day it was finished, Pete hung the door on its hinges and stepped back and looked at it with the expression of someone seeing a completed thing and trying to understand that they helped build it. Darnell was already inside checking the floor levelness, calling measurements out to Coop, who was writing them down. The building smelled of fresh-cut lumber and new worked earth, and the temperature inside was noticeably cooler than the outside air, which was exactly what the north slope placement was supposed to achieve. Evelyn walked the length of it twice. She checked the drainage. She checked the ventilation gaps she had specified in the design. She stood in the center of the building and looked at the empty shelving that would hold the barrel racks and thought about what this space was going to become. The volume it would hold, the contracts it would support, the work that would fill it through the coming seasons. Caleb was standing in the doorway. "Well," he said. "It's good," she said. "It's exactly what I planned." "High praise from you," he said. "It's accurate praise," she said. "That's the only kind I give." She walked back toward the door. He moved aside to let her through, and they stood together outside in the spring morning, looking at the building in the way you look at something you built from the beginning, with the knowledge of everything it took and the understanding that the thing itself doesn't show you that, can't show you that, because finished things always look simpler than the making of them. "Bray wants to talk about the cooperative idea," Caleb said. "Formally. He's been talking to 2 other ranchers in the valley. They want to meet. Next week is better than this week. The first Laramie delivery of the season goes out Thursday, and I want to be here for it." "Next week, then." She nodded. She was already thinking about the meeting, what she would need to present, what the cooperative structure would require, what each rancher's operation could contribute, and what they would need in return. She thought about something Darnell had said 3 months ago, about his grandmother's beeswax seal, about how knowledge becomes useful when it gets to the right place at the right time. She thought about what it meant to build not just a ranch, but a network, a set of relationships and practices and shared standards that could outlast any single season or any single person. She had not arrived at Hawthorne Ranch intending to build any of this. She had arrived intending to make salted beef and find a place where her abilities were worth something. That was the whole of what she had asked for, and it had not seemed like much at the time. It had seemed like a reasonable thing for a woman who had been told consistently that she was asking too much. What she understood now, standing in the spring air outside the building she had designed from memory, was that the problem had never been what she wanted. The problem had been that every place she'd been before had been too small for what she actually was. Not through malice, mostly. Through the ordinary human habit of looking at a person's surface and deciding you know the depth. She had not been too much for any of those places. Those places had been too little for her. The difference mattered. It mattered because one reading of that history was a story about a woman who had to fight to be seen, which was true but incomplete. The more complete reading was a story about capacity, about what happens when the right conditions finally exist for something to grow, the way it was always going to grow if given the room. She hadn't changed when she came to Hawthorne Ranch. She had not become something different or discovered something hidden in herself. She had been exactly this all along. The ranch had simply been a place large enough to show it. That was what she believed, and she believed it not as comfort or self-congratulation, but as a fact she had observed about the world, that most people were more than the positions they'd been placed in, and that the distance between what a person was and what they got to become was mostly a matter of whether someone was willing to look past the first obvious thing and see the second less obvious one. Caleb had looked. Not immediately. She had no patience for a story that prettied him up into someone who saw her clearly from the first moment. He hadn't. He'd looked at her on the station platform and done what people do. But he had kept looking after that first moment. And he had kept asking the next question after the first answer. And he had kept bringing the relevant documents without being asked twice. And that capacity for revision, for continuing to look past the first conclusion, was rarer than people understood. She thought this, standing in the spring air. She did not say it. Some things are true in your own understanding before they're true in words, and she was a woman who knew the difference. The first Laramie delivery goes out Thursday, Caleb said. He had been watching her think, which he did sometimes, patiently, without interrupting. Pete and Darnell are confirmed for the run. I know, I want to review the load manifest tonight. Of course you do. And I want to send Cross a letter confirming the delivery timeline. He should hear it directly, not just see the delivery arrive. You want him to know we communicate proactively. I want him to know this is an operation that doesn't make him wonder, she said. He spent 4 years dealing with suppliers who made him wonder. I don't want to be that. Caleb nodded. Tonight then, after supper. After supper, she agreed. They walked back toward the main house together, through the yard that was now familiar in the way places become familiar when you have worked them through enough seasons. The particular sound of the gate, the slope of the ground near the barn, the way the light fell across the east quarter at this hour. It was not a dramatic beauty. It was the better kind, the kind that accumulates, the kind you don't notice arriving but suddenly realize has been there for a while. Bess was at the kitchen window. She saw them coming and turned back to whatever she was doing at the stove, but not before Evelyn caught the expression on her face. The particular expression of a person who is satisfied in a way they didn't quite expect to be. Evelyn understood it. She felt something like it herself. The Laramie delivery went out on Thursday, on schedule, with 33 barrels loaded and roped and the manifest copied in triplicate and Pete and Darnell provisioned for the 3-day run. Evelyn watched the wagon pull out at first light and then went back inside and started the day's production work because the next delivery cycle began the morning after the first one left, and the work was continuous in the way that all good work is. Never fully finished, only ever advancing. The cooperative meeting happened the following Tuesday. Bray came with 2 other ranchers, a man named Calvert who ran a smaller operation on the valley's south edge, and a younger man named Eli Marsh, no relation to Gideon, who had inherited his father's property 2 years ago and was, it turned out, struggling with some of the same storage and rotation problems Hawthorne Ranch had presented when Evelyn arrived. They sat at the kitchen table, all 5 of them, because Caleb and Evelyn both sat, and Evelyn laid out the cooperative structure in plain language. Shared quality standards, coordinated delivery schedules, combined negotiating capacity with buyers, individual ownership retained, no one ceding control of their own operation, only agreeing to coordinate the parts that were stronger together than apart. Bray asked 3 good questions. Calvert asked 2. Eli Marsh mostly listened and nodded with the focused attention of a young man trying to absorb more than he'd expected to need. When she finished, there was a silence. Not a resistant silence, the thinking kind. Then Bray said, I want to know how you handle it if one member of the cooperative fails a delivery commitment. Written agreement with specific consequences, Evelyn said. Graduated penalties for first failure, suspension of cooperative benefits for second failure, removal for third. It's not punitive. It's structural. The cooperative only works if everyone who is part of it meets the same standard. Fair, Bray said. He looked at Caleb. You're agreeable to all of this? I'm agreeable to everything she's proposing, Caleb said simply. She's thought it through more carefully than I could. Bray looked at Evelyn. Something passed across his face. Not quite an apology, because he hadn't said anything that required one. More like an acknowledgement. A man recognizing that the thing he'd been cautious about had turned out to be more solid than the caution warranted. All right, he said. Let's talk terms. They talked for another 2 hours. By the end of the afternoon, the Blackthorn Valley Beef Cooperative had 4 founding members, a written framework for its operating principles, and a meeting scheduled for the following month to formalize the structure with Marsh's legal guidance. After Bray and Calver and Eli Marsh had gone, Pete and Darnell had returned to their work, and Bess had taken her coffee to the other room. Caleb and Evelyn sat alone at the kitchen table with the papers from the meeting spread between them. Caleb looked at the founding agreement, 4 names on it. 12 months ago, he said, I was trying to figure out how to survive the spring. I know. Now we're building a cooperative. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. How far ahead are you thinking? She considered this honestly. 5 years is the clearest. The cooperative at full operation, the 3rd storage building running at capacity, the Laramie contract at the 30% increase level. She tapped the papers. Beyond that, it gets less clear, but that's not a problem. 5 years of clarity is more than most operations have. He looked at her. And personally, how far ahead are you thinking personally? She met his eyes. Farther than 5 years, she said. Considerably farther. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers briefly. Just for a moment, in the uncomplicated way of 2 people who had built something together and understood what it was worth. Good, he said. Outside, the Wyoming afternoon was going gold and long across the valley, and the East Quarter cattle were moving in their unhurried way through grass that was green and properly managed, and from the new building came the faint sound of Darnell checking the shelving installation, measuring things twice the way she had taught him to. Evelyn looked at it all, not with sentimentality, because she was not a sentimental woman, but with the clear and specific satisfaction of someone who has done difficult work well and is honest enough to recognize it. She had come here as a stranger in a town that had already decided what she was. She had come with her ledger and her knowledge and the accumulated understanding of a woman who had spent her life paying attention to things other people walk past. She had not arrived with a plan to become indispensable. She had only arrived with the intention to work as hard as the work required. What she had learned, or not learned so much as confirmed in the way you confirmed things you already understood but needed to live through, was that the world's first assessment of a person is almost always incomplete. It is made quickly with whatever information is most visible, and it mistakes the surface for the depth. It looks at the body and misses the mind. It looks at the origin and misses the capability. It looks at what a person has been and fails entirely to account for what a person is going to do. She had spent years being the object of that kind of incomplete assessment, and she had survived it, and she had come to the quieter end of understanding that the assessment said nothing permanent about her and everything permanent about the limitation of first conclusions. This was not a lesson she had learned easily. It had cost her years and a fair amount of pain and the particular loneliness of being chronically underestimated by people who never bothered to look again. She would not pretend otherwise, and she would not dress it up into something tidier than it was. But she was here now. The ranch was here. The cooperative was forming. The tributary ran clear through the East Quarter. The 3rd storage building stood solid on the north slope, smelling of fresh lumber, waiting for the work that would fill it. She had not found this place. She had made it, the way all things worth having are made, slowly, imperfectly, with more difficulty than anyone watching from the outside could fully see, and with the stubborn, clear-eyed persistence of a woman who had decided a long time ago that the world's first answer was not the only one available. She gathered the papers from the meeting and put them in order, the way she put everything in order. She would file them after supper. She would review the next week's production schedule before bed. She would get up before 5 and walk the East Quarter in the morning light. There was work to do. There was always work to do. She picked up her pencil and she got back to it.